Good morning, colleagues. Let me begin by thanking the hosts for the last night's dinner. It was wonderful. I hope you had a good night's sleep and full of energy. We have a very interesting program today. For those of you who do not know me, let me introduce myself. My name is Ahmet Yıldız. I am a member of Turkish Parliament and rapporteur of the Subcommittee on Transatlantic Relations in NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I am a diplomat of a Balkan country, Turkey. Turkey is a Balkan country by profession. I served in my career as ambassador to Sarajevo, and I served there as a NATO contact point ambassador for 3 years. And in my dialogues with all components in Bosnia and Herzegovina, with political parties, with civil society, I have never felt outsider or third party. That's why I really attach importance to the deliberations here, and I wish some improvements in the Euro-Atlantic path of the countries in the region. This morning, we will discuss the bilateral and regional issues that have an impact on the stability of the Western Balkans. There is certainly no shortage of issues that the countries on the region need to address, not only bilaterally, but also in a regional context. That is also one reason why we have 4 prominent speakers, important speakers for this panel. Let me briefly introduce the panelists. Our first panelist is Nemanja Starović, State Secretary, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Serbia. He is Professor of History and served in various functions on the City Council of Novi Sad, a beautiful city. And he served in the Government Office for Kosovo and Metohija between 2014 and 16. He has authored a collection of historical essays, one of them Middle East, Short and Clear, and novels such as On the Other Side in 2016 and Divided City in 2018. He is the author of the show Inostrane, is it right pronunciation? Inostrane, which has aired on the first channel of RTV television since 2016. He is a regular member of Matica Srpska, an association of writers of Serbia, and the founder of S. Miletić Foundation. You have 15 minutes, if it is enough, for in the floor. If you need more, okay, it is understandable because it is a very interesting subject. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is a great honor for me for having this opportunity to address such distinguished panel. I will present my speech in Serbian language, but before that I wish to apologize because I will need to depart early before the end of this panel. So with that in mind, I will start right now.
You will get the questions.
Yes, I will get the questions, no problem. Zadovoljstvo mi je da
It is my great pleasure to participate in the 101st Rose-Roth NATO Parliamentary Assembly seminar that is being held for the 4th time here in Belgrade on the 15th anniversary of Serbia's membership in the Partnership for Peace. The partnership relations are based on our military neutrality policy and wish for practical cooperation in all fields of mutual interest. 7 neighbors of Serbia are members of NATO. The Republic of Serbia respects political determination of other countries. On the other hand, we expect our military neutrality policy to be respected. The Kosovo and Metohija issue is the largest security issue for Serbia. It's an important part of partnership with NATO. NATO. We appreciate KFOR presence in their strict and unbiased performance of their mandate, and they ensure a stable and safe environment and free movement for all. We expect NATO and KFOR to act proactively and protect Serbian community in Kosovo and Metohija and their assets. Since the beginning of this year, there have been 114 ethnically motivated incidents. It is extremely important to obey the agreements reached within the Brussels Agreement, and the armed forces of Kosovo should not have access to the north of Kosovo without permission of KFOR, without notifying Serbian community. All the countries in the region want better cooperation, because that's the only way to have sustainable cooperation. And cooperation is the basis for the foreign policy of Serbia in general. Last year was one of the most dynamic years in the newer history of Serbia. In geopolitical changes, there are the foreign policy credibility and power of Serbia have been increased thanks to Serbia's success in the field of economy, and the fact that Serbia is characterized as a driver of economic development. Serbia has been cooperating with neighboring countries. We help them with humanitarian assistance and provided other assistance. We have showed a high level of mutual solidarity, because Serbia has been building constructive relations with its neighbors lately. The decision of Serbia to provide some vaccines to its neighboring countries that ask for this help, and Serbia has also enabled citizens of neighboring countries to get vaccines in Serbia. So about 200,000 citizens from the neighboring countries have been vaccinated in Serbia. We have also provided some donations to the countries of Africa, Middle East, and some other countries. So we have donated about over 1 million doses of vaccines. It is very important to note that Serbia sees it as a humanitarian issue and not as an issue that should be politicized. Tackling remaining open bilateral issues is a priority for Serbia. We are committed to tackling these issues through dialogue with mutual respect, equally, and adhering to mutually acceptable principles. So Serbia believes that only with such an approach can we actually find sustainable solutions. Serbia has proved to be honestly interested in tackling open issues as soon as possible. We are aware that we have inherited some open issues, particular issues we have with our neighbors. However, Serbia is contributing to relaxation of our relations. Serbia is dedicated to promote positive agenda, future-oriented agenda with its neighbors. Serbia is trying to focus on development of economic and other forms of mutually useful cooperation. It estimates that it could contribute to generating a favorable environment in the region that will enable tackling inherited issues. The activities we all have a common vision, integration of all the countries into the European Union, the European integration process, strengthening regional development, internal reforms in the EU aspiring countries are very much complementary. However, the fact that the EU membership is not that close, and that the perspective is not that certain, is having a negative impact. Serbia has remained, has shown that it is honestly dedicated to continuation of regional cooperation, and it showed readiness to tackle bilateral issues. Having in mind this blurred perspective of EU membership, the leaders of Albania, North Macedonia and Serbia have decided to take certain initiatives on their own. A few months before the pandemic, the President of the Republic of Serbia, Mr. Aleksandar Vučić, together with the Prime Ministers of Albania and North Macedonia, Edi Rama and Zoran Zaev, launched an initiative in Novi Sad to move barriers in these three countries, the barriers to the four freedoms which the EU is based on. That's the freedom of movement of goods, services, people, and capital. Over the past 2 years, leaders of these three countries have had regular meetings. In July this year in Skopje, not only did they sign 3 new papers, but they also agreed that the initiative that had been known as Mini Schengen should be now renamed into Open Balkans. The latest summit of the Open Balkans initiative in November this year, new measures were adopted. The importance of this initiative is multiple. From the economic aspect, there will be savings that are larger than foreign direct investments, and it will, of course, enable thousands of workers to find better jobs in any of the three countries. From the political point of view, they have shown vision and readiness to take the future of the region in hand, and the perception of the region is changed worldwide. Balkan, which was known as a place of wars, is now one of the fastest growing regions. Of course, these three countries need to become EU member states as soon as possible, and until this happens, other Western Balkan countries are invited to join the Open Balkans initiative. The Republic of Serbia believes that the issues such as missing people, war crimes, and succession agreement implementation are some of the issues that Serbia is focused on tackling. These are issues inherited from the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. As for the cooperation with Albania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Serbia is focused on all the areas of mutual interest. Our relations with Greece are traditionally very good, and we have signed a joint declaration on strategic partnership between our two countries as one of the most important foreign policy activities of Serbia in 2019. Marked the highest level of cooperation between our two countries. Once again, it is my great pleasure to participate in this seminar because this is a good platform to exchange opinions on security and other issues, and I wish a lot of success to all the participants today.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Starovic, for these kind remarks. I am also happy to see that Turkish-Serbian relations are going very well at the highest level. Now we come to our other panelists. Of course, since yesterday we talked about also Kosovo. Kosovo is part and parcel of the issues that need to be addressed if we want a stability and security in the Balkans. So we are glad that our second panelist will be able to provide us with an update on KFOR's activities and views on the current situation. Gyula Somogin serves as the chief political advisor to the current commander of KFOR, Major General Ferenc Kayari. He is a career diplomat, and before being appointed to this current post, he was head of department for the Hungarian Cultural Institutes abroad and the head of the section of the Western Balkans Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary. He was posted to Skopje as the deputy head of mission at the Hungarian embassy between 2014 and 2018. We are glad that you could join us today and are looking forward to your briefing. Please, the floor is yours as long as you need. Thank you.
Good morning, Excellencies, Ministers, Parliamentary members, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants. I'm pleased to be here with you today to represent KFOR at this prestigious event. KFOR remains a key factor for stability across Kosovo and the broad Western Balkans region. Our mission stands fully committed to the daily implementation of its mandate as per United Nations Security Council Resolution 1244 of 1999 to ensure a safe and secure environment and freedom of movement for all people in Kosovo. Indeed, KFOR's role fits into a wider context. And in this way, the normalization of relations between Belgrade and Pristina through the EU-facilitated dialogue is a telling example of a bilateral issue which carries great importance also for regional stability. The 26th KFOR commander, Major General Ferenc Kajari, assumed command on the 15th of October 2021. He has outlined his vision on KFOR's continued implementation of its UN mandate, and he has, in several instances, reiterated the remarks made by NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg that the normalization of relations between Belgrade and Pristina represents the only path towards achieving a lasting political agreement and stability for the region, and that NATO firmly supports the EU-facilitated dialogue to this end. Today, I will give you some insights how KFOR performs its mission within the context of those political issues, which have an impact on the security in our area of responsibility and more broadly across the region. Within KFOR, the Political Advisor's Office is responsible for monitoring political developments. The office I'm leading takes a particular interest in political developments that could turn into security challenges on the ground. Our task, obviously, include following developments in the EU-facilitated dialogue. We all know that political issues have a direct impact on people's livelihoods, their living conditions, their plans, and even their dreams. The last 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic have reminded the world that the link that exists between policymaking and people's daily lives. In the region, restrictive COVID-19 prevention measures aimed at alleviating suffering and negative impact of COVID-19 have mobilized public opinion. They have, at times, been met with criticism and resistance. This is especially true when measures aimed at easing suffering and stopping the spread of the virus start affecting people's lives by hindering their movements and contacts with others. Political issues discussed in the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue are no different. Recent events related to the use of license plates illustrate clearly how politically difficult topics can affect the security on the ground and the freedom of movement. KFOR played a fundamental role as this issue unfolded. Our former Italian commander held extensive engagements with a range of interlocutors on the ground to avoid any further escalation. And following the recent arrangement on de-escalation and the way forward in northern Kosovo reached between Belgrade and Pristina, under the auspices of the EU-facilitated dialogue, KFOR supported its implementation through the deployment of a temporary, static presence in the area. Overall, a political solution is always preferable to kinetic action. Nobody knows it better than those who know conflict and have felt the horrors of war. I am, of course, talking about soldiers. This is why KFOR remains present across the territory of Kosovo and will continue to provide the necessary security framework in which political discussions can continue. As I have stated before, our focus remains on the daily implementation of our UN mandate. Overall, though, KFOR has a flexible posture on the ground, which allows us promptly tackle any development that could affect the security situation across Kosovo. Freedom of movement is only one of those issues which can turn into potential triggers for destabilization. These include, amongst others, the provision of basic goods and services, as well as the protection of critical infrastructure, issues related to the implementation of local governance. KFOR has been following electoral processes in Kosovo, including the latest local elections organized by the institutions in Kosovo on 17 October and 14 November. The elections occurred without violent incidents or any significant impact on security. This is in itself a good omen for the consolidation of security in Kosovo and for regional stability. Major General Kajari has reiterated NATO's and KFOR's resolute support to the EU-facilitated dialogue. We in KFOR welcome all efforts aimed at normalizing relations between the institutions in Kosovo and Serbia. As the first Hungarian general to lead KFOR, Major General Kajari's command represents a continuation of Hungary's commitment to NATO's mission in Kosovo. Hungary and the other 27 troop contributing nations to KFOR remain committed to promoting regional stability in the Western Balkans. With 3,700 troops from 20 NATO member states and 8 partner nations, KFOR embodies NATO's unwavering and collective commitment to regional security and stability. Any changes to the mission's posture will be condition-based and not calendar-driven. This point was reiterated loud and clear by NATO heads of state and government when they met on the occasion of the NATO summit in Brussels this past June. The current situation is generally stable, and KFOR maintains its visible, strong, and agile presence on the ground. COM KFOR 26 envisages a KFOR mission with sustained capabilities, able to act as trusted and capable responder to security challenges. KFOR remains committed to providing a safe and secure environment for all communities in Kosovo. In so doing, we rely on the continuous and sustained cooperation with all counterparts, the institutions in Kosovo, with Serb representatives, and with the Serbian armed forces. Furthermore, our liaison and monitoring teams, KFOR commanders' eyes and ears, continue to conduct daily engagements with the local authorities and population. They report back to us the needs of people across the whole territory of Kosovo, in cooperation and coordination with their various interlocutors, with the aim, ultimately, to ensure that our daily efforts continue to contribute to the well-being of all communities living in Kosovo. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir. We are grateful, both KFOR in Kosovo and UFOR in Bosnia, for their sacrifices for peace. Before moving to other panelists, as he said, Mr. Starovic has to leave for other obligations. May I get the questions to him? He will answer the questions, and after listening to other panelists, we will make another question and answer session. Please, the questions to Mr. Starovic. Fritz Felgentreu, yeah, from Germany. Yes, German colleague, yes.
Thank you, and thank you, Your Excellency, for your very thoughtful presentation. Maybe trying to clear a way for our next speaker, I was just wondering if you could say something about how worried the Serbian government at this moment is about interior conflicts between the different entities within Bosnia and Herzegovina. Could this have an influence on destabilizing the region, and what kind of influence could Serbia exert to stabilize this neighboring country?
Thank you very much for that question. We attach utmost importance for the preservation of political stability in our neighboring and friendly state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We are also very well aware about the deep political crisis that is unfortunately ongoing there. And I want to remind you, for instance, that although there is a lot of finger pointing at the moment at the political leadership in Banja Luka and the entity of Republika Srpska, unfortunately in the larger entity we don't have a full functioning government for full 3 years after the general elections in 2018. So it is saying a lot about some structural issues and structural type of the political crisis that needs to be resolved. As for the ongoing developments in recent several months, we are at the disposal to provide our good services at any moment to help to resolve these issues. We don't believe in any kind of imposed solutions, because imposed solutions cannot lead to sustainable and durable results. The only way to solve both structural issues and structural problems and the current ongoing crisis is through the dialogue that must include both entities of Bosnia and Herzegovina and all three constituent people. And I will also add one more thing. There is a lot of finger pointing, not just at Banja Luka as such in Republika Srpska, but more personally at the Serbian member of presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Mr. Milorad Dodik. And although I can agree that some of his actions may be too harsh, even erratic at moments, I don't think that is the sole or even main cause of the political crisis that we are having right now. It is to a much more extent reaction to certain issues and problems that have occurred. So I think his reactions are more reactive than proactive, and that there, if with a little of goodwill and a positive approach aimed at solving these core issues and core problems, I think there is a lot of opportunity even for him to make a step back and to engage in political dialogue. So we have some concrete issues with the forests in Republika Srpska, with agricultural land in Republika Srpska, and certain decisions by the Constitutional Court. And I think that if there is a possibility to solve those core problems, then all the consequences that have occurred after that can be also solved. It is much better to deal with the core issues and core problems than with the outcomes and specific manifestations.
Mr. Bastian?
Minister Starovic, just a question of clarification, if I understood the translation correctly. I'm quoting now. You said that the armed forces of Kosovo should not have access to the north without approval of KFOR. Does that mean that if KFOR approves it, you would also approve it?
Well, as you know, according to United Nations Security Council Resolution 1244, the Republic of Serbia does not have a real stake in providing security in the area of Kosovo and Metohija. It is the main responsibility of the KFOR mission under the mandate of that specific Security Council resolution. However, we have reached the deals with NATO as provider of the KFOR mission that concern the issue of deployment of the Kosovo security forces and all other security forces which are militarized in a way to the northern part of the province, specifically for Serbian inhabited municipalities or municipalities with Serbian majority. There are two preconditions for deploying such type of military or militarized or military-like forces. One precondition is the official approval and invitation by the commander of the KFOR mission, and the other precondition is invitation by the 4 mayors of Serbian inhabited municipalities in the north. If only if both preconditions are met, the deployment should be possible, but unfortunately we have seen, I think, we had 6 instances, if I'm not wrong, where those two preconditions have not been met, but the deployment nevertheless happened. And we are condemning such kind of actions.
Mr. Frides from Switzerland, followed by Asım Saraylic from Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais vous poser une question.
I'm going to ask you a question. You can put your headphones on. Thank you. I have a question that has an impact on Swiss home policy. It's very rare in NATO, but we have 200 troops in KFOR. They're in the ground in contact with populations and what we call LMTs, with the activity that was actually described by Mr. Sumoji. On two occasions with the Swiss Parliament, I went on the ground there, and I felt the tensions on edges of the Ibar River. And in my country, we are recurringly talking about withdrawal from KFOR. I got the answer on the Kosovo side. People hope we can stay as long as possible because stabilization is going to take a very long time. I'd like to know what your position on the Serbian side is on the importance of maintaining Swiss troops who have this neutral character, which is very helpful when it comes into getting in touch with different populations.
Thank you very much for raising this important issue. We are attaching a great value to the KFOR mission and their deployment in the area of our southern province of Kosovo and Metohija. We believe they are the most important provider of security for all the people living in our southern province. And we also believe it is of utmost importance that the number of troops should not be contracted, so that the number of the members of the KFOR mission remains at least the same, because it is the only force that is enjoying the full respect and trust of people for providing them security. So also regarding your great country, we are really appreciative for the great contribution that Switzerland is giving to the successful conduct of the KFOR mission.
Asım Bey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Poštovanje Nemanja Starović, uvaženi gospodine Vcinić.
Mr. Starović, I'll be very short, having in mind that you're short with time. Appreciating your answers and the complexity, about the complexity of situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I can only note that you are trying to make something simpler. Dialogue, there is no alternative for dialogue, that's clear. Respecting the constitution of the Bosnia and Herzegovina and the stage at which the country it is now, that's necessary, of course. However, some things cannot be taken for granted, and based on the constitution or court decisions in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you cannot interpret some things and neglect some other things. Some things are guaranteed and they're not commented. There are no comments about it. So the simplification about the relation of Mr. Milovan Dodik and his actions, well, things are not that simple. What we are discussing in the parliament and saying in the parliament is that his actions are not in line with the dialogue that we want to. Of course, the status of the Serbian people is unquestionable in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but you cannot interpret one thing and neglect other things. You know that there is a dispute related to the Bosnian language that is not recognized in Republika Srpska, but we cannot simplify things and we cannot manage to do things just through the internal dialogue in Bosnia and Herzegovina without the influence of those who are guaranteeing the Dayton peace agreement. Thank you. I understand you. I believe this is more an argument than a question. I believe we have quite a different opinions on some issues. I'm also aware of the fact that what I said and what you are saying is indicating only some aspects of a very complex issue. Let me reiterate that the official Belgrade is and has always been ready to provide services to help establish communication channels that would lead to a dialogue that is the only way to tackle these complex issues.
It seems there is no more question. Then thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Now we move no question. Okay. Now we move to our next speaker. I am very interested to listen to him. Mr. Joseph Birkic is Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In this function, he chaired the Commission for the NATO integration process of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Before this, Mr. Birkic served as ambassador to the Kingdom of Spain and Morocco for Bosnia and Herzegovina and held several senior positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of European Integration. Since 2015, Mr. Birkic is the International Secretary of HDZ, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Croatian Democratic Union of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I am very excited to listen to him because I had discussed these issues with your predecessor, Ana Trišić-Bebić, as Deputy Minister and Coordinator of NATO Affairs for 2 years. I hope to listen some good improvements from you. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, NATO Parliament Assembly members, members of the national parliaments, esteemed colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I would like to greet you all and thank our hosts for having us and hosting us here in Belgrade. Special credit goes to Mr. Šormaz. Despite these very challenging times as well, we are all fighting with pandemic and facing either natural disaster, energy issues and so on, having those heavily affecting everyday lives of citizens of our countries. But moreover, the economy, stability and security. I believe it is of utmost importance to keep on having a friendly dialogue and discussion, exchange of views, opinions and ideas, regional cooperate, maintaining good neighborly relations, support, and last but not the least, have solidarity towards each other. Bosnia and Herzegovina is a country fully dedicated to the EU integration process as its strategic foreign policy priority and goal. We have invested significant effort in addressing European Commission opinions, key priorities, and diligently worked on moving forward on our EU path. While recognizing the importance of the region's strategic anchoring within the EU actions, initiatives and plans for the future, it remains vital to discuss modalities on how to deepen our political dialogue, security cooperation and strategic engagement, reaffirming our shared commitment to work towards strong, stable and united Europe. Although Bosnia and Herzegovina, as many other countries, faced so many difficulties last year, it still managed to successfully put certain processes in motion. And as a part to respond to your introduction and questions. Just briefly, let me to inform you that in February 21, Council of Ministers of my country approved implementation of the Reform Program 2020 and established the Commission for the Cooperation with the NATO. Due to the political internal dialogue, Membership Action Plan or Annual National Program in Bosnia and Herzegovina is called Reform Program. The reform program for this year, 2021, was unanimously approved by all members of the Commission, coming from different constituted people. The program 21 was first made public through e-consultations, and having no objections on it, it was delivered to the Bosnia and Herzegovina Council of Ministers for the further procedure. The Bosnia and Herzegovina Council of Ministers has not had it discussed yet due to the current blockade of state institutions. Still, reform program remains one of the tools to continue our NATO path, a cooperation framework, and future steps. Its reforms are completely compatible to those identified by EU. Promotions of reforms in essential to stabilize and prosperity, just as they are crucial opportunity to deepen partnership with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. My country, Euro-Atlantic path is a way to create and implement so needed significant reforms for the citizens, economically, security, stability-wise. Even when reforms implementation is complex and currently on standby, Bosnia and Herzegovina remains committed to its EU integration, to which there is no alternative in our view. We do support likewise the Western Balkan countries to eventually reach its strategic goal of becoming EU members. Having been given the opportunity for fruitful and constructive cooperation through NATO open door policy, we appreciate this great chance that is not to be wasted. Open door policy is a proven tool to cooperate and to address security challenges and risks together. It is a true value of our partnership, an added value, as no country is able to fight so many challenges, especially at the same time, such as pandemic, natural disasters, organized crime, illegal migrations, or any other security challenge that we, as the world today, can be faced with. Partnership is important to make. It has always been. Bosnia and Herzegovina remains committed to its cooperation and partnership with NATO, and the process of making required reforms needed to be stability and prosperity of all Bosnia and Herzegovina citizens. It is up to Bosnia and Herzegovina to identify and lead the reform process, having been assisted and supported by our partners, both NATO and the EU. It needs to be based on the internal consensus. As a partner country, Bosnia and Herzegovina participates, together with NATO, in disaster response operations too. This enabled it to develop own national civil emergencies and disaster management system with assistance from the alliance. Within its own capabilities, Bosnia and Herzegovina actively participate in peace supporting missions. It has gone a long yet successful way to become a peace provider by participating in NATO-led peace support operations in Afghanistan, for example, and it's making its contribution, enabling a closer link to the allies. As you know, on November 3rd, 2021, the UN Security Council extended 1 year mandate for EUFOR Althea mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is an important decision security-wise, having EUFOR as a factor in security and stability of Bosnia and Herzegovina in keeping of safe and secure environment. The stability and security of Europe is also closely linked to the stability and security of the Western Balkans. Resilience of the Western Balkan countries, strengthening of their security and stability is closely linked to a stronger support of the EU neighborhood and reaffirmation of the EU and or NATO perspective. EU membership perspective has significantly contributed to continuing process of the region, although it has been lately burdened by frustration of the Western Balkan region, lacking tangible results. Yet engagement and striving of EU to reaffirm the focus of the Western Balkans is highly appreciated, whether it is strengthening of political or reinforcing of economic ties, both within the Western Balkans or between the Western Balkans and the European Union. This region has no alternative but to further cooperate and build mutual understanding, solidarity, and trust. The whole region itself must continue with its effort to work on reform process, keeping towards the EU membership. The enlargement is the strongest EU tool to promote, upgrade, and strengthen security, stability, prosperity, and peace in this region. My country, despite many recent turbulences, remains committed to democratic values, the rule of law, human rights and fundamental freedoms, good neighborly relations, and regional cooperations. And it strives for good relations with all of the countries, especially neighboring ones. Excellencies, allow me to conclude with reiterating that no matter how hard the Euro-Atlantic process is or how long it takes, it is still doable. We believe that it's doable. We will remain committed to enhancing and maintaining cooperation with all of our partners, partners within the region, partners within the European Union, EU itself, and the NATO as such. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, sir. Indeed, we should all help Bosnia and Herzegovina. I have great sympathy for politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina because they have a very challenging job because of the systemic problems and unfortunately blockades by RS and especially SNSD on our issue, on map issue, on the NATO process. I hope you can solve it. Indeed, in the Peace Implementation Council, international community voice is for Bosnia and Herzegovina to unblock this process, but unfortunately till now it didn't happen. I hope during your term you can succeed in this. Now we move to our next panelist. He's a very valuable analyst, senior analyst, Marko Prelec. Marko Prelec covers the Balkans for the International Crisis Group. He holds a PhD in history from Yale University, a prominent global university, and has taught at the United Nations Naval Academy and the Central European University School of Public Policy. He also worked as a researcher in the International Court, ICTY, we can say it there, Prosecutor's Office, and led researcher at the State Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and was founding executive director of the Balkans Policy Research Group. He will provide us with his analysis on the latest developments in the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue and the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here this morning, and I'm going to take advantage of my role as the designated member of civil society to try to be somewhat more provocative and entertaining than my fellow distinguished panelists can allow themselves to be, constrained as they are by the need to be sober and responsible representatives of their respective governments. I'm going to reverse the order that was just announced and begin with the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because I think it is without any question the more serious of the two and the most serious political and security challenge facing the Western Balkans today. And then conclude with a few words about the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia. So, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, first I want to offer a framework for how to think about, or at least how I think about, the problems of facing that country, and begin with a long time horizon, and then I will turn to the acute crisis that I'm sure is on everyone's mind. The basic problem, as I see it, in Bosnia and Herzegovina is that almost everyone, the people and the political leaders alike, strongly dislikes possibly even hates some fundamental aspect of the constitutional framework. By saying that, I mean, if it were to happen, so if you were to go to people and say, you know what, I've come back from the future, and 50 years from now, things in Bosnia are exactly the same as they are now in terms of the political and constitutional framework. I think everyone would be very unhappy to hear that. Unfortunately, the things that people are unhappy about they go in opposite directions, okay? And in fact, they go in two almost perfectly balanced opposite directions. So roughly half the country, almost exactly half the country, would prefer to see a strengthening of the state institutions, the institutions centered in Sarajevo, the institutions of Bosnia-Herzegovina, what is sometimes referred to as Bosnia-Herzegovina becoming a normal country, a normal state, like other states in Europe. And the other half views those same institutions with dissatisfaction, fear, or outright hostility, and would like to see greater distance from them. So you have half the country pulling toward the center and half the country pulling away from the center. And this has been the case for a very long time, going back to the war and possibly even before the war. There are nuances within these camps, of course. There are people who are quite moderate and who would accept a slight strengthening of the central state institutions within the framework of a broadly federal structure, whereas there are others who are more extreme and who would like to see the abolition of the entities and the establishment of a unitary state. And on the other side, there are people who would like to see somewhat more autonomy within a common state, and others who are more extreme and who would like to see a separation, secession from it. When I say that this is the basic problem of Bosnia-Herzegovina, I don't mean it's the only problem. And here I feel the need to draw attention to something that is often presented as a counter-narrative. And it goes something like this. What people really care about in Bosnia-Herzegovina, what the citizens really care about, is not these kinds of nationalistic disputes, but instead they care about the quality of their lives. They want good jobs, they want good schools for their children, they want good, reliable medical care, they want to have a safe pension, they want to breathe clean air and drink clean water, they want to be governed by honest, non-corrupt, and effective leaders. And as it happens, all of those things are associated with the ideals of the European Union. So when we say that Bosnians want to see their country make progress on the European path, it's another way of saying they want these good things. And it is absolutely true that when you survey people, and this has been done many, many times, when you ask people everywhere in the country, in Banja Luka, in Mostar, in Foča, in Sarajevo, doesn't matter where, you get large majorities saying that these are in fact their priorities. And then commonly people in my position and in the position of others who are trying to advise leaders about what to do make a fateful mistake. Because it does not follow that people in Bosnia-Herzegovina are willing to accept the loss of what they perceive as their core national values in exchange for making progress toward these good things that they really do want. So if you were to pose the question, to an average person that you stop on the street in Banja Luka and say, would you accept the dissolution of Republika Srpska in order to have these good things, EU membership? These questions tend not to be asked in surveys for, I think, obvious reasons, but my feeling is you would hear no. And if you were to accept, if you were to ask someone in Sarajevo, would you accept the secession of Republika Srpska in exchange for the rest of Bosnia-Herzegovina becoming well-governed and clean and prosperous and a member of the European Union, I think people would also say no. So on some level, it just is true that these national disputes are really highly valued, and political leaders know this. They're not idiots. And in some level, they are giving people what they want when they give them these incompatible nationally based disputes. They're giving people what they want, just not very cleanly or not very well. So we have to work on solving this problem, and I think this is the main one of the core points that I would hope that you take away from my comments this morning. It's very important to work on solving this fundamental problem, which will take many years, okay, and a lot of work along several different directions, and not simply content ourselves with putting out the fire that is currently burning in BIH. Hopefully, there exists a win-win solution. Hopefully, there exists a way to arrange things in Bosnia and Herzegovina that is better from the point of view of all the major constituencies than what we have now. It's not, I think, a naive or unduly hopeful thing to say that. There are many countries that also have basic divisions between how they organize things. There are many divided societies, and they have managed. Okay, many of them are in Europe. They have managed to find a way to move forward. So this means, I think, a policy change at a high level for the European Union, for member states of the European Union, for the United States, for others that may wish to be of assistance, to offer assistance to the leadership of Bosnia and Herzegovina, perhaps Turkey, perhaps Russia, to prioritize trying to find a deep and fundamental change to the way that country is organized that is better for all of its communities. But we can't do that now because there is an acute crisis that is threatening not only the stability of the country, but indeed its very survival and its peace. So this has got to be stopped and addressed immediately before we can do anything else. So to use a medical metaphor, the patient has chronic problems, but they're also in critical condition. So you have to put them in the ICU, make sure they live through the night. Not to be overly dramatic. Nothing's going to happen overnight. But we have to deal with the critical problem before we can move on to the others. And here we have two separate currents of dissatisfaction that have come together. There's the separatist drive of Republika Srpska, which I think we're probably relatively familiar with because it's been in the news, and then the other somewhat less prominent but also quite important problem between essentially a large part of the Croat community, or at least the main Croat party, Croat Democratic Union, or HDZ, and a range of Bosnia-oriented or Sarajevo-based parties having to do with the election law, how elections are run. So it is possible that things could go wrong, very wrong, over the time scale of about a year to a year and a half. And it can happen in many different ways. Just to give one example so that we can have something to imagine. It's easy to imagine that there's no resolution whatsoever to the election law dispute, and that as a result, the elections are extensively boycotted next October. And that the people elected in those elections have a legitimacy that is rejected by about half of the country. So that in itself is a bad situation. And at the same time, it's possible, in fact, not only possible, but perhaps even likely, that the National Assembly of Republika Srpska will take a range of steps that irrevocably damage its relationship with the state, and set up a situation in which we have two different and incompatible legal orders on the territory of the country. one obtaining in Republika Srpska, following the legislation of that entity's legislature, including illegal steps that they have announced they intend to take to withdraw their consent to common state institutions, and another one obtaining on the remaining territory. And the problem that you have there is that ultimately there are people who are charged with enforcing the law, and those people are armed. So in the first instance we have police, and it's quite easy to imagine police coming into contact with other police. One of the things, for example, that Republika Srpska has announced the intention to withdraw from is the border police. So it's quite easy to imagine a situation in which something like what has happened at the Kosovo-Serbia border happens at the Bosnian border, in which border posts are burned down, or you have one newly created quasi-border police trying to take over from another, shots are fired. Things could become very, very tense. I don't think we're looking at anything like the resumption of conflict on a scale of the early 90s, but definitely we could have incidents that lead to loss of life. You could have other very, very bad consequences, people setting up checkpoints, decline or end to free movement across the country, barricades, high tension in ethnically mixed areas along the ethnic dividing line. So this has really got to be stopped. And my suggestion for how to go about doing this, there are many ways. I think one that I find myself drawn to is the policy pursued by the Clinton administration in 1993 and 1994 that began with assembling a coalition of forces who agreed on the need to defend Bosnia and Herzegovina, and by ending the fighting between then the HVO and the army of BIH. That could be done in this case by trying to reach ideally a formal agreement on the election law. If that is impossible, as it may well be due to shortage of time, then at least a gentleman's agreement that prevents a boycott and allows for a supermajority, a greater than 50-50 majority within the country to defend its integrity against the challenge coming from Banja Luka. And then to turn, if we can make it through the elections in one piece, and then to turn without any delay to a internationally facilitated and assisted process aimed at addressing the underlying problems. And let me now say a few words about the Kosovo-Serbia situation. The first of which is, for many years, I and my organization, International Crisis Group, was arguing for trying to find a comprehensive solution as quickly as possible, because we were concerned that problems like this, there are certain moments in which the iron is hot, so to speak, and you can strike and find a solution, and once they pass, the disagreement can become extraordinarily stable and persist for decades. So we've argued that people should be willing to take risks to solve the Belgrade-Pristina dispute. I think today it is no longer possible, realistically, to think about reaching a comprehensive solution. And I should say, with deference to our hosts and respect for their perspective, for me at least, a solution to the Kosovo-Serbia problem is a mutual recognition of two sovereign and independent states. I think this is not something that is realistically possible in the near or medium-term future. In order to have a solution of that type, you need to have two strong, we would need to have two strong leaders with solid support in their respective countries who can see eye to eye and who are both willing to take risks to their own political careers and to make compromises, including very painful compromises, in order to reach an agreement. We may or may not have had that in past. We definitely don't have it today. So I think we're not going to have a solution. The good news is there are a lot of things that we can do short of that. And some of them are essentially almost free. And it is quite sad that we're not doing more of them. The situation between Kosovo and Serbia is not like the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. You can have an impasse that lasts decades because you have two states that each operate on their own terms and that are each capable of exercising the responsibilities and duties of government without regard to the other. Within Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's an internal problem, even an internal sovereignty problem, where the state's ability to exercise its responsibilities is in question. So there we cannot really, I think, accept the perpetuation of the status quo. Kosovo, Serbia, we can. So what I would hope to see in coming years is the leadership of both countries taking steps to foster goodwill, to foster trust and confidence. And in order to do that, you have to show goodwill, to show respect. This can be done relatively easily by, for example, behaving in a friendly and respectful way toward the respective national minorities. So toward the Serbian population of Kosovo, toward the Albanian population of Preševo Valley. Okay. Often, unfortunately, leadership of both countries does the opposite. You know, go visit those places. Talk to them, if possible, in their own language. That is a significant sign of respect. To do things that make life better for them. When they are challenged and have problems, there was reference to the large number of ethnic incidents and crimes committed against Serb population in Kosovo. The leadership should be right there, the day after, showing its support for them instead of being missing. Initiatives like the Open Balkan are another thing that could be done, and that could be taken further. Even some of the things that came up in the somewhat comical Trump administration initiative of the last year were not all bad. The idea of having airline connection, for example, between Pristina and Belgrade, that's a good idea. So things like this could be done. And let me close on this note. These are all things that are designed to be temporary solutions, patches that are applied while we're waiting for better times to come. They may end up being permanent, and that is another reason to work on them with energy, dedication, and imagination, and without delay. We all hope, of course, that the countries of the Western Balkans will make progress toward and someday join the European Union, and will probably, before that day, continue to join NATO, as quite a few of them already have. But that may not happen. Okay, there's nothing inevitable about this process. There are many reasons why it could go off. And that is a reason why we need to not see the implementation, the agreement of and implementation of interim steps as an alternative or a distraction from the important work of European integration, but as a complement to it and as something that may become, as others have pointed out, in the history of the European Union itself, many interim pragmatic steps later were built into the architecture of what came to be the permanent arrangement of the EU. And the same thing may happen in the Western Balkans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for this very comprehensive and brave analysis. I think it will attract many questions. Now we are going to the Q&A session for 3 of our panelists. I think we have the first question from our host, Mr. Dragan Shormaz. Yes, Dragan, the floor is yours. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm going to speak on Serbian. This is Serbian Parliament.
First of all, I'd like to add a few things. We, as the NATO delegation, are being commended for being good hosts. Thank you all. We are going to have a pleasant day today. But I'd like to say something about Bosnia and Herzegovina. I was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm a Serb that originates from Bosnia and Herzegovina, from Bosansko Grahovo municipality. I don't know whether I'm close to Mr. Brkić's hometown. I know I'm close to Nikola's hometown. I am even entitled to get Bosnia and Herzegovina nationality. But today you're going to visit the town where I grew up, in Smederevo. My father was a judge by vocation, but the municipality of Bosansko Grahovo is now within a part of the Bosnian entity, so it's not part of Republika Srpska. And I have to tell you that, ethnically speaking, it was made up of majority Serbs. Not a single municipality Bosnia and Herzegovina had as many Serbs as Bosansko Grahovo in percentages before 1991. It means 98% of population were Serbs. However, my father, during Tito's Yugoslavia, left Bosansko Grahovo to Belgrade to study. So it was, he studied law school, so he went 700 kilometers away to Belgrade to graduate. He didn't go to Sarajevo or to Zagreb to graduate, to study. What I'm trying to say is that even in past times, you know, we have a false image of what it was like in the past. I've been an MP since December 2000. And let me repeat, I was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I have the right, I'm entitled to Bosnian nationality. I'm entitled to have a Bosnian passport. We have a bilateral agreement with Bosnia. I even have the right to candidate for an MP in Bosnia and Herzegovina one day if I want. Perhaps I will win against Nikola in elections one day. But okay, now you see he's worried. I have to say that I have two homes, Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I feel this. However, what have we been saying for 25 years? I've heard Mr. Prelec and the others, but today, 25 years later, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are international actors, EU4, that are present in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have foreign judges in higher courts. I mean, why don't we have the state of citizens, of entities, of peoples living in Bosnia and Herzegovina without presence of international forces? Why is it so? Are we all to be blamed in the region? Is Bosnia and Herzegovina to be blamed? Is Milorad Dodik to be blamed? Well, he used to be one of the favorites of the West. I think the West brought him to Bosnia and Herzegovina, right, Mr. Prelevac? That's what happened when they wanted to fight against the then political party that ruled in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Well, let us all wonder what's the problem. My colleague from Turkey can say, how many times has Mr. Erdogan visited Sarajevo and Belgrade? Did we agree on building up Belgrade-Sarajevo highway? Did we jointly insure loans for the construction? When I say all of us, I'm talking about Belgrade and Ankara. Did we do the project for the highway? Yes, we did. So we'll have two, actually, tracks of highways, one through Visegrad, one through Sarajevo. What about the other part of Drina? When will we finish the project? When we will start building, constructing highways? Is it more important than constant rows and conflicts? Do we want this region to be constructive? Social media have been crucifying me since yesterday because I expressed my opinion about the mural Vratko Mladic. I got the words of appreciation from Sarajevo. In my opinion, and I'd like to hear what Mr. Prelec and Brkic think about this, but in my opinion, there are many problems, but one of the source problems is electoral law. It needs to be amended and adjusted in Bosnia. I don't think that Mr. Brkic thinks Mr. Komšević is his representative. He's representative of the Croats in the council. As for Kosovo and Metohija, I have to add something, and it's related to what Mr. Shomogi, I'm not sure whether I pronounced this well, Shomogi, I'd like to hear his opinion about this. Namely, yesterday there were, or the day before yesterday, were local elections in Kosovo and Metohija. Do you know who won in those elections? If you want to have a look at the number of municipalities. Serbian list, 10 municipalities. The best result was achieved by the opposition party with 9 municipalities, whereas PDK, and the party of the so-called Kurtis government in Kosovo won 4 municipalities, and the opposition 9. I have to tell you one thing. We talked about the agreement. I'm very, very much familiar with the mandate of KFOR in Kosovo and Metohija. And I've often been the only one here saying that they cannot react at this moment, they have to wait for this or that to happen. Rosu, the units who come to the north of Kosovo are special police forces, and they always come to the north of Kosovo giving under the excuse of fight against organized crime. When I say north of Kosovo, it's the municipalities with majority Serbs. The now government of Kosovo has tried this on several occasions over past several months. You know what has happened, but it wasn't worth it. He has won only 4 municipalities, which means that not even Albanians in Kosovo and Metohija are interested in incidents, in conflict. People are interested in living, in salaries, in pensions, in having jobs, in what we call in Belgrade, perhaps naively, open Balkans. We have open signed agreements with North Macedonia and Albania. And perhaps we should all support the dialogue, EU-facilitated dialogue. But, ladies and gentlemen, Serbia has always accepted invitations from Brussels at the highest possible level, and we have always been constructive. So let us sit together and make a constructive agreement. However, KFOR would, because we are more talking about security and safety issues here, KFOR would be, maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe KFOR needs to be more decisive in letting Pristina know that they can no longer send special units, even if these are police units. If they have, issue with crime, corruption, they have regular police forces, they have prosecutors that could work on this, and they should not send, armed vehicles and to the north of Kosovo, which are then sent to the administrative line, and then the Serbs would serve them with coffee and a piece of bread to eat while they're staying there, no problem. So why did they go there? Why are they provoking people? There is no need for this. Let us tackle regional issues peacefully, and let's go where we belong to the EU.
To answer. And may I get one more question and two more questions, and to direct them collectively to panelists. Mr. Frides, yes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je suis médecin en Suisse et je soigne des patients kosovars, des patients serbes. Et 25-30 ans après les événements,
25 to 30 years after the events, I'm a doctor in Switzerland and I've been taking care of Serbian and Kosovo patients, and 25 years after the events, and I still see tensions amongst them, and I can see how difficult it must be after all this over everything that took place. And I am persuaded that the solution must come from the top. It really is something that is going to give hope, a new boost to all these countries, who amongst them will make commitments for peace and allow the EU to move forwards. So I'm with my friend Ahmed Tildis. I'm a member of a Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and I'd like to mitigate my words. I was certain that when you entered an alliance or European, an important European institution like the Council of Europe, as many countries did in a day, we'd see an end to conflicts, wars amongst the members of this council. But what did we see in these past few years? This conflict between Ukraine and Russia, the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia as well. So, yes, take the high road, but what do we need to implement to make sure that the dialogue, peace, for a peaceful resolution of conflict instead of turning to arms or weapons?
For Ms. Bilali Zendeli from North Macedonia. Is there any further request for questions? Otherwise, I will close. Mr. Aydın from Turkey. Okay, yes, Ms. Zendeli.
Thank you. My question goes to Mr. Marko Prelec. You made a very specific point. You said that if you ask people in Sarajevo if they want a better life or they want to have Republika Srpska, they will choose Republika Srpska, not a better life. Am I right? If they have to choose among a better life, fresh air, and so on, or Republika Srpska, they will choose Republika Srpska, not a better life. In my opinion, this sounds quite pessimistic. Unfortunately, sometimes countries in transition or post-communist countries have to do some sacrificing to get or to achieve an aim. And North Macedonia is a very specific case of changing the name in the dispute with Greece and becoming a member of NATO. Unfortunately, we still didn't achieve to become a member of European Union, but due to yesterday's brief of a High Commissioner of European Union, it will be done in December this year. We will get that date for opening negotiations. And now, my question is that, do you think that as long as this opinion remains in Bosnian people, there will not be a progress or a step forward integration in EU and in NATO? We have also colleagues from Bosnia here who maybe can intervene and give some feedback because it sounds quite interesting. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Aydın from Turkey.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I would like to ask a very brief question to Marko Prelec. Honestly, to be honest with you, I have been enlightened, with the illuminating synopsis of the problem presented by yourself. And you have successfully used the metaphor of the patient and the treatment of the patient. So if you were in the position of treating the patient, because you said there are some acute problems. On the other hand, the critical case is more important than the other. So if you would like to be the solving in a position of the region, what can be your priority in getting rid of this problem? What is your priority, sir? Thank you.
Now I close the list with Nicola from Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is the last question. Okay.
Dobar dan, zahvaljujem, pozdravljam predsjednika.
I'd like to greet the chairman and the other panelists. Just a few comments, just like my colleague from Turkey has said. It has really enlightened us what Mr. Prelec was saying, although I have to say that he said he would speak provocatively, if I remember well, and a bit differently. Well, that's exactly what happened. I have to say that that's exactly what happened. And I'd like to answer to Mr. Shorma's, yes, that's right, I belong to Croatian people from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Mr. Komšić is not member of the council. We did not elect him, but that's in line with Dayton, and it has happened for not second, but for the third time. This is something we are trying to tackle, and that's a little bit what Mr. Prelec was mentioning. I don't have a concrete question, but perhaps just to give a comment. I believe that he presented situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina quite dramatically. It is really a complex situation and problematic situation. However, my colleagues that were listening to him actually saw it too dramatically. Perhaps it's a good warning so that something that shouldn't occur doesn't occur. But I don't think it's not that dramatic as he presented, but it is complex. And not only did Mr. Prelec say it here, but I could hear this in other sessions related to EU and NATO integration seminars and conferences. Namely, the society of Bosnia and Herzegovina is divided. I'd like my colleagues, panelists, to understand that society in Bosnia and Herzegovina is a rich society, meaning that it is complex and multinational, but multi-ethnical. And it has been so for centuries now. That's the wealth of Bosnia. You know, if we talk about this has been the case, this multi-ethnicity has been the case for centuries. So we cannot say that it's divided, but it's rather complex society, and this is where solution needs to be found. Should the Dayton Agreement be changed? Well, I'm one of those who believe it should be changed. However, the reforms that have also often been discussed in Bosnia and Herzegovina are usually boiled down to some frauds. What you want to reform with regard to the Dayton Peace Agreement, I have to tell you that Washington, it was said that the whole Bosnia and Herzegovina will be a federal republic, but it has not been fulfilled. So it often, all the politicians want to they have their own political interest, and each entity wants to impose their own solutions. But let us respect what we have achieved through the Dayton Peace Agreement. Perhaps if we only abide by the agreement we signed, then perhaps we could make some progress. You also mentioned about the opinions of citizens in Banja Luka and Federation. You know, let me tell you, people in Bosnia and Herzegovina are not stupid. They have elected their representatives for years now, and no one has had a comment from international observers. Well, you were saying that the nationalists are to be blamed for everything. Of course, citizens want a better life, but they're not stupid. Thank you very much. I apologize for being...
No. Thank you, Nico.
Thank you.
I will give the floor to panelists for answering the question in the same order. I wish them also to get their opinion on what can we do as NATO and NATO to overcome some of these problems and especially to unblock NATO path of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Thank you. The floor is, let's start with Deputy Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In brief, I'll sum up some of the questions and comments that were raised today. Bosnia and Herzegovina is truly living the biggest crisis after the Dayton Peace Agreement back in 1995. Political crisis. It's not that much painted as the stability or security, but it is very deep political crisis. One of the reasons why we are living this political crisis is because we are, or some also from the international community, are neglecting the formula, very simple formula, that brought peace to my country and which is maintained there for 26 years, which is the achievement. Having in mind all of the difficulties and having in mind all of the challenges that we have. And that simple formula from the Dayton is 3 constitutive people, 2 entities, 1 state. Once again, 3 constitutive people, 2 entities, 1 state. Anyone who is touching this equilibrium or trying to go with the centrifugal forces or centripetal forces that was discussed and described by the Mr. Prelec, Marko, is basically, you know, working against the formula that brought peace to Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think that there is political wisdom not to jeopardize the peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina with this deepest political crisis, but at the same time there are guarantors of the Dayton Peace Accord who are there and who are engaged in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it's not only the big or the countries, but also organizations and institutions. Plus, the framework, international framework today is somewhat very different than the framework of the 90s. So I am convinced that with the mediation and support of the friends, this deepest political crisis will overcome, so that the institutions can work, so that we can work with something which is very important. In my view, the paramount issue in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is the electoral law, making all 3 constitutive people and all citizens in Bosnia and Herzegovina inclusive in the process. You could hear from the members of the parliament in Bosnia and Herzegovina that we have deficiencies in the electoral process, that where 1 constitutive people is electing representatives to the other constitutive people, so which definitely is not enrooted in that formula from the Dayton. 3 constitutive people, 2 entities, 1 state. And at the very end, I would like to thank you all for using the full name of my country, which is Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to this extent also thank you for your contribution, Marko, and for the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Shormas, for your question. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude for the great hospitality you received us during this conference. As you know, KFOR has special glasses in front of our eyes, and we monitor the situation in order to identify those issues which might raise security concerns, which might pose threats to the safe and secure environment and to the freedom of movement. So we are continuously monitoring the situation, the atmospherics, and we deliver those messages which cause all authorities to find political solutions to all of the problems. As for the police action you mentioned, I cannot comment on those because the police actions belongs to the EU-LEX mandate and not KFOR mandate. We follow those actions, but we do our job only if there is a security concern as a result of any police action. Thank you.
I'm honored and somewhat flattered to have so many questions. I'm going to try to combine my answers. One thing that, it wasn't really explicitly a question, but the Honorable Mr. Shormaz pointed out the important role of the international community, yeah. And the way that I think about this is because the leadership of Bosnia and Herzegovina has been fundamentally divided about many important issues. And because the state, in its original form in 1995 and 1996, was so terribly weak, and because it was impossible to agree to strengthen it to the point that it could plausibly survive through the political process, the normal political process, recourse was had to the non-political process, which included things like decisions of high representatives, but also decisions of non-political bodies like the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina and international courts, notably the European Court of Human Rights, and at times even the European Union itself, imposing conditions that were not imposed on other countries. And this worked. So we now have something much closer to a viable state in BiH than we had back then, when there were no common license plates, no common passports, no common anything, just 3 ministries, etc. I think one way to read what is being done now by President Dodik is as an attempt to stop that process. Yeah. This was the first, the imposition by Valentin Inzko in July of this year was the first such imposition in 10 years. So it was kind of breaking a truce, so to speak. And there were a number of other decisions that were not taken by the High Rep, including the Constitutional Court case on the forests of RS that also suggested that we might be moving back into this kind of non-political state-building process. To the question of whether I was too pessimistic, yeah, probably. I tend to be very pessimistic. There are reasons to be optimistic too. I mean, I don't sense hostility between the communities on a personal level at all in Bosnia, and there's some good research that suggests that at least in the younger generation, people are very happy to have friends and colleagues and even to marry across ethnic lines in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and are not threatened or disturbed in any way by interethnic mixing. That they like to travel throughout the whole country. They don't want barriers to go back up. Not everyone, there are still people who are, afraid, but to a inspiring extent, and to an extent that is not the case in Kosovo, for example, where there are quite exclusionary views on both sides, and a lot of fear and hostility. So that is hopeful. There's also the fact that people are willing to accept something less than their ideal. So when I say, I wasn't talking about Sarajevo getting rid of Republika Srpska, but I think I was talking about people in Banja Luka, would they give up the existence of Republika Srpska in exchange for a better life? Some would, but more would be willing to accept staying in Bosnia. Okay, even the ones who would prefer not to be in Bosnia, they would still say, okay, if the offer is we stay within Bosnia, we're still autonomous, and we have these other good things, yeah, sure. So that this is what I was referring to without going into detail as a win-win solution, some kind of compromise. And that, in fact, may be what Todek is aiming for. It is very hard to know because the moves of him and his leadership have been very erratic. In fact, the assembly was supposed to have taken some very serious steps already last month. They keep getting pushed back further and further. So there's some indication, and there's some indication also that the position is softening. So most recent of this was a willingness to accept continuation of the armed forces of BIH, if that could be negotiated. Okay, so it may be that what he's actually shooting for is something else, but it is nonetheless a very serious political crisis. To the question of what are the guardrails that can prevent conflict, I think the international bodies and membership in international bodies like the Council of Europe will not in itself do that, as it has not, you're quite correct, between Russia, Ukraine, and even NATO membership is not guaranteed to do that. Within NATO members, we have the defensive alliance between France and Greece, two NATO members. Sort of interesting. That's not to say that they're without value. I think it would be very good for Kosovo, for example, to become a member of the Council of Europe, so that its citizens could have recourse to the European Court. That would be good for the Serb minority, okay, which has been the subject, or you could even say the victim of some unfortunate rulings by the national judiciary, and has had no recourse outside the country. But I think in the near term we need to have international troops in both countries, absolutely. And finally, in terms of what is the priority, I think the priority it would be very good for the whole region if Bosnia-Herzegovina could advance beyond the current impasse, and it really is an impasse. I mean, I gave an address to it was a keynote address actually to a Rose-Roth seminar in Sarajevo about 10 years ago, and it was essentially the same presentation. And people thought it was maybe too harsh, but in the last 10 years, there's been very little progress. Very little progress. I mean, it is true, as Minister Brkic has said, that there have been some things that have been done, but positions have not really moved. So it would be very inspiring, as the Prespa agreement has been inspiring for others in the region. And not just the Prespa agreements, also relations between Albanian minority and the Macedonian majority within North Macedonia are also an example for the region. So these kinds of things could really help. So I think that would be certainly my priority. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now we come to the end of the panel session. What a nice panel it was. I am grateful to all panelists and to all you. Indeed, as someone who served in the Peace and Collaboration Council, I tend to participate in your analysis and views. Let's hope that the region will progress as a whole, and we will have a share on this progress, remembered by our sons and grandsons, hopefully. Thank you very much. Now we will have a 15 minutes coffee break, hosted by Dragan. Okay.
Dear colleagues, I'm Ivan Klementьevs from Latvia, chairperson of the Subcommittee on Transatlantic Economic Relations. Our previous panel focused on bilateral and regional issues that are relevant for the stability and security of the Western Balkans. However, unlike some remote island nations in the Pacific, the Western Balkans are located in the heart of Europe. So, development in neighboring regions and the activities and action of outside actors can have a meaningful impact on the countries here. We have therefore invited 3 speakers to brief us on the influence that outside actors have here and the possible implication for the region. Let me briefly introduce the panelists. Our first speaker is Jens Bastians. Jens Bastian is Senior Policy Advisor at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy and an independent economic consultant and financial sector analyst. His main areas of expertise concern China's expanding investment and bank lending footprint in Europe. As a consultant of the ABRG, he authored in July 2017 a report on China's growing infrastructure engagement in Southeast Europe. Mr. Bastian will speak on China's influence in the Western Balkans. Mr. Bastian, we are eager to hear your views. Please go ahead. As usual, 15 minutes.
Ivan, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Dear delegates, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank our hosts for this opportunity, Roberta for the invitation and the organization. I've never spoken in my professional career in a parliament, so I'm honored today to do so in the Assembly of Serbia here in Belgrade. We've heard about China already yesterday and today. The Hungarian delegate, for example, yesterday addressed China. We've heard from the Prime Minister of Serbia in her extensive reply regarding China, and various other delegates have had bits and pieces. So in many ways, China is on the agenda, as is the case here in our panel. I'd like to address some factors, as the title of the panel says, that characterize China's initiatives here in the Western Balkans, but also more broadly in Southeastern Europe. The point of departure clearly is, and there's no way to ignore that, China has firmly planted its flag in the region. This flag is visible, and the wind is blowing strongly. China has commenced this activity with what I would call anchor investments, in particular, given the metaphor anchor, in maritime, in port investments in a number of countries in Southeastern Europe, be they in Greece, be they in Bulgaria, be they in other parts of Southeastern Europe. This maritime initial investment has gradually expanded and diversified across countries and across economic sectors. And we can today argue that this footprint is gradually being consolidated. When China does so in individual countries, it focuses on the given conditions of this country. For example, also the modus operandi of coming to agreements with political elites in the given country. That means there are conditions and opportunities that prevail, for example, in Serbia, that are not the same in Bosnia-Herzegovina or, for that matter, in Montenegro or Bulgaria. The only country in the Western Balkans where China is not invested is Kosovo. And that is for obvious political reasons, because it respects and it agrees with Serbia regarding the non-recognition. But when I say that it looks at individual conditions, I would also argue that China's investment is strategic. You start with ports, you gradually expand that, you connect ports with each other, and you highlight how these ports can be connected with highway construction, for example in North Macedonia, or with rail construction projects. Take, for example, the Budapest-Belgrade rail project, or in the highway construction in North Macedonia, or railway investments in Greece. That means there's an element of connectivity that you can identify in such a strategic approach. And it requires, in order to do all that, a financial sector footprint. That means that Chinese banks, for example, the China Development Bank or Exim Bank, they have provided lending arrangements, for example, with regard to thermal power plants, with road and bridge construction, or as recently an agreement regarding the construction of technology business park here on the outskirts of Belgrade. Let me turn, ladies and gentlemen, specifically now to some aspects of Sino-Serbian ties. Now, the foreign minister of China, Wang Yi, visited just last month Belgrade, and he hailed the China-Serbian friendship, and I quote, as an example of standing on the right side of history. I underline that, standing on the right side of history between China and Serbia. In my view, you can identify here how Minister Wang Yi is trying to nudge Serbia, is trying to highlight to what degree these ties have expanded, have consolidated, have deepened. And I also think that in this message of standing on the right side of history is an element of be part of a development model that is successful. At least this is how China advocates it when it usually uses the terms win-win cooperation between countries in the region. How do these ties develop between Serbia and China? Bilateral trade is the largest between both countries in the region, and it is trade that is heavily tilted in favor of China. A huge trade deficit for Serbia. But Serbia is not alone here. Every other country in the region has a trade deficit with China. But no other country trades so extensively in the region like Serbia with China. China has also invested in no other country of the region such volumes of foreign direct investment as in Serbia. For example, in the mining sector, take the copper industry, the zinc industry, or lignite-fired thermal power plants, for example, Kostolac. And there is, some of you will have heard it, read about it, there is China's vaccine diplomacy, very active here in the country, being hailed by both presidents as a success story. China has provided vaccines not only to the Serbian government, but the Serbian government has subsequently also onward given some of these vaccines to neighboring citizens, or citizens who have then traveled from their neighboring country to Serbia to receive a vaccine. There is also, and this is a new development, and I'm slightly surprised it has not been mentioned yet in this meeting. There is also for the first time that China has managed to enter what I would call the military-industrial complex in Serbia. In 2019, the Serbian government decided to buy 6 Chinese armored drones, and they have been delivered in July of last year. And this kind of security cooperation between Belgrade and Beijing continues. For example, the Serbian government has expressed an interest to upgrade its so-called Pegasus drones with Chinese military technology. Serbia has the right to do that. It is, as we have heard repeatedly, a neutral country. It can choose where to do that. But it does it for the first time to open the door to China also in that area. And it is a sensitive area that has raised red flags in Brussels, not only with the European Commission, but also at NATO headquarters. And some NATO countries, members of NATO in the region, have taken note of that development. Let me come to my third point. Over the course of the past 10 years, China's footprint in the region has not come unchallenged. What we can observe in the course of the past, I would rather say 2 to 3 years, is that China's reputational capital is being called into question. There are various developments that highlight that. There is a demand across countries in the region for greater transparency of the specific Chinese lending and investment arrangements. Just to give 2 examples, we were reminded recently with regard to Montenegro and the sensitivity of a lending arrangement regarding the building of a bridge, how intransparent that agreement is. Only later did the government in Podgorica learn, the new government, of the very arduous commitments in that arrangement. A demand for greater transparency also concerns, for example, the Budapest-Belgrade railway project. In particular, in Hungary, this project has been put, so to say, into the drawer, while people are asking, tell us more about the details. That demand for transparency is important, and in my view, it is possible to deliver there more than in the past. There is also a sense of pushback with regard to China regarding environmental protection investments. We have heard that there are 16 coal-fired power plants operating in the region. 4 of these power plants in 2 countries of the region are being financed and partly constructed by China. There is a demand in particular from parts of NGOs, civil societies, but also from increasingly political parties in the region to ask for greater environmental recognition, sensitivity. That is, for example, also a discussion taking place in the city we will visit this afternoon in Smederevo. And me as a China interested person, I would very much have liked to visit the Chinese investment in Smederevo and also the winery afterwards. Finally, there is, and this is something where China, I think, is starting to gradually learn. Namely, there's a greater demand across countries in the region that the local economies that are subject to Chinese investments, to Chinese lending, to bridges or railway projects or highways, that the local economies benefit more. The arrangement in the past has been bring Chinese services, Chinese construction workers, and other forms of Chinese dependence. That arrangement is being called into question, and it is important to write into future contracts the added value for local economies when doing business with China. I think this is a critical point. I come to my last aspect. While I talk about China, and in the course of preparing this presentation, I have noticed something that was gradually already addressed once yesterday by Mr. Majotorovic, and that is, we should not commit when we focus on China in the Western Balkans the fallacy of exaggerating this influence. It is important to take note. It is important to also make agreements with China, to also challenge some of these agreements, possibly rewrite them also. But I would also argue, while in the past decade we have had an insufficient focus on China's activities in the Western Balkans, there is a concern of mine that we are now replacing this previous insufficient focus by rushing to only focus on China. And I think that's misleading. And I think this is not the way to address a neglect of the past and try to rectify it today. I think that we shouldn't commit a political and analytical blunder of exaggerating China's influence in the region. It is there. It will continue. But keep it in perspective. Keep a balance when analyzing it. Don't tilt, in my view, don't tilt too far in the direction of only focusing on Beijing. For the moment, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Basten, for your very nice speech. Our next speaker is Orhan Dragac. Orhan Dragac is founder and director of the International Security Institute in Belgrade. He is a frequent commentator and publishes on current political, economic, and security topics. He has also authored 2 books, The Modern Intelligence Security Community, Utopia or Reality, and 2 Phases of Globalization, True and Deceptions. Our speaker is member of Chatham House, United Kingdom, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and member of Royal United States Institute, United Kingdom. Mr. Dragac will speak on Russia's influence in the Western Balkans. Please, Mr. Dragac, take the floor.
Distinguished colleagues, dear friends, thank you for the opportunity to speak today at this important meeting, and I'm particularly pleased because it is organized on the occasion of the 15th anniversary of Serbia's accession to the Partnership for Peace program, which I deeply believe is one of the most important strategic decisions of both Serbia and NATO in the last few decades. In the next few minutes, I will try to answer the topics which I gladly accepted from the organizers, considering the fact that I have been dealing with it a lot in my research and as well as through the activities of the institutes of which I am the founder and director, and that is Russian influence in the Balkans. The shortest answer to the question whether this influence exists, whether and what it is in its nature could be yes, it has existed for a very long time, and it is now negative, and I would add that it has been negative since it existed. I want to step further, make an assessment of whether this impact will exist in future, and whether it will exist in what will be by nature. Well, I think that this influence will not disappear or change its nature. The real question is, how can Balkan resist this influence to the extent that it will not disturb its progress and full integration into the European cultural and civilizational zone to which it truly belongs? It is most often said that Russian influence in the Balkans manifests itself in 3 forms: through historical, cultural, and identity ties, then through the economy, and finally from the aspect of security, that is geopolitics. I will pay more attention to the economic, security, and geopolitical aspects of Russia's interest in this region, because I consider them essential and the only one that Moscow has towards this area. As for the first aspect, cultural historical identity, I believe it's fabricated, not authentic, that it's not in the interest of Russia, except as an effective means to reach the remaining 2 forms of influence in the Balkans. As for the Balkans and the above all Serbia and Montenegro, that alleged feeling of cultural identity closeness with Russia comes from the sphere of myth and not as a reflection of real historical closeness and a sense of belonging to a common cultural identity. Apart from the legend of the eternal Serbian-Russian brotherhood, none of today's living generations can provide tangible proof of their personal collective closeness to Russia. To put it simply, people in the Balkans do not have personal contact with anything that is Russian. They did not travel to that country, nor have they welcomed guests from Russia. They haven't studied in Russia and never bought Russian products. They have no friendships, and some business connections date back only 10 to 15 years. The feeling of closeness with Russia was imposed through the local conservative pro-Russian policies from the 19th century until today. This feeling is not even pro-Russian. It is essentially anti-Western in a cultural sense, and its intention is to oppose progress, democracy, and all its institutions. That essence of Russian influence has been preserved to this day and will remain present in the future. I just want to say that the Russian influence is very strong, which Moscow uses very skillfully and, I must admit, with a lot of success. This is a field of sentiment and propaganda and the so-called soft power, and especially the hybrid influence through misinformation, amount of which is really huge. I will say that all the state visits from Russia to Serbia have been at the highest level, and at the times when the anniversary of the victory of the Second World War was being marked, or on the anniversary of the beginning of the NATO bombing. Check the calendar. For over the past 15 years or so, you will see that Putin, Medvedev, or Lavrov in Belgrade unmistakably on one of these two dates. The message should be, remember who set you free and who your friend was when it was hardest for you. Russia's position in the Balkans has fluctuated greatly in recent 3 years. Let's go back a few steps back to 2016, 2017. Russia lost in the Balkans whenever it appeared. And I will concentrate on the then Macedonia and Montenegro. At that time, Russia invested huge political, financial, and even intelligence resources to ensure the positions of their allies in Macedonia and the then Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski, to prevent Montenegro also from crossing the threshold and join NATO at any cost. It lost on both fronts, and lost convincingly. The extremely pro-European and pro-NATO government of Prime Minister Zaev came to power in Skopje. In Montenegro, political tensions over NATO membership lasted for months, culminating in an attempt to overthrow the government by force on the day of the elections in October 2016. I have compared these two events on purpose. Moscow did not even try to camouflage what outcome it expected, so it used different qualifications for street demonstrations in Podgorica and Skopje. According to Moscow, Western mercenaries marched in Skopje and authentic representatives of people against the corrupted government in Podgorica. Defeat followed in both places at a great price. Montenegro survived the most serious attack on its sovereignty. Soon it became member of NATO, and Russia had to withdraw. Today, in both countries, Russia has managed to regain its position, first through the victory of its allies in last year's elections in Montenegro, and recently with the defeat of the coalition around Zoran Zaev in the local elections in Macedonia. In both cases, the huge responsibility for returning Russia to strong position in this part of the region goes to the European Union, NATO, and the United States. Zoran Zaev's government is directly destabilized by the European Union's reluctance to open accession talks, despite all the Skopje's efforts to return to the European track. On the other hand, the narrow election victory of pro-Russian parties in Montenegro was celebrated as victory of democracy and not as an entry into the scene of conservative anti-Western forces which seek revision of all previous decisions that reformed Montenegro, brought it to NATO and at the very door of membership in the European Union. Ultimately, the new authorities are pushing for a renunciation of state independence and for Montenegro to return to its former state alliance with Serbia. As for Serbia, as the largest, most influential country in the region, Russian influence is strong, it is versatile and long-term. I will not go far into past. I will focus on the economic, political, geostrategic aspects. Because I believe these aspects are the aspects Russia is interested in. An important milestone in establishing Russia's influence in Serbia occurred in 2008, when the energy agreement was concluded, and with this, Serbia gave over its huge natural, technological, and economic resources to Russia. That agreement sealed Serbia's long-term energy dependence and at the same time opened the big door for other types of influence, the corrupt and destabilizing ones. The oil industry of Serbia, NIS, was sold at the time for about 3 times lower price, as shown by some independent studies on the assessment of the value of the company. There is no doubt that this catastrophic business, driven by the then political interest that Russia as an influential state and above all as a permanent member of the Security Council, is tied as an ally on the most difficult political issue for Serbia, and that is Kosovo. For 13 years now, the oil company in the industry of Serbia, NIS, has been the center of Russian negative influence in Serbia. From its economic strength, a de facto monopolist on the oil market in Serbia, but also a huge player in the region, come the financial levers of Russia's influence on economic and political flows in the country and the region. This industry is a direct transmission of Moscow's political, economic, and intelligence interest in this area, and it achieves that in the gray zone of sponsoring those activities that fit into Russia's state strategy in the Balkans. These activities are very wide. They hold memorials, they sponsor influential media, they have anonymous, unregistered online platforms. These are powerful channels for spreading misinformation, even through fan groups known for violence and illegal business. Let me remind you that when Vladimir Putin was welcomed at the Red Star Football Club Stadium in 2011, where he briefly appeared in the company of the Night Wolves Biker Club, then thousands of fans enthusiastically shouted and at the same time insulted the then president of Serbia, Mr. Tadic. Because of that, Vladimir Putin did not go to the University of Belgrade, where they prepared an honorary doctorate for him, and he showed what he thought of them. And it all happened on the March 23rd, the day before the anniversary of the beginning of the NATO bombing of Serbia. As for the attitude of political factors in Serbia towards Russia and its influence, I will try not to talk in black and white tones. There is no doubt that the government in Serbia and President Vučić as the most influential political figure, they foster a very close relationship with Moscow, and we cannot expect great changes in that sense. There is no particularly rational reason for that, regardless of the fact that the economy of Serbia, but also all other countries in the region, are largely tied to the economies of the European Union. Trade and especially energy cooperation are huge and currently have no alternative. At the political level, Russia is a factor seen in Belgrade as the most influential protector of its interest around Kosovo on the world stage. On the other hand, Serbia's interest in this issue is in opposition with Russia's long-term interest, because unlike Belgrade, which seeks a quick solution through compromise, Russia seeks to preserve the status quo for as long as possible, and thus to a permanent focus of Serbia's instability and stagnation in European integration. The greater the chances of a compromise between Serbs and Albanians, the political and other influence of Russia will decline. The reason is simple, because with the achievement of a solution for Kosovo, Russia loses an important lever of influence on Serbia. It becomes insignificant in that sense, and that opens space for new distancing of Belgrade from Moscow. Some experts and politicians believe that the Aleksandar Vučić government is unreservedly turned to Russia, and that his formal pro-European politics is just a facade. According to my deep conviction, and according to the information I have, completely identical attitude towards the authorities in Serbia exists in Moscow, where the Serbian government and the president are treated as insincere allies because they are essentially turned to the West. I think it is important to remind here of few facts which are often forgotten or set aside because they do not fit into the usual black and white narrative. I will remind you that Serbia recognizes the sovereignty of Ukraine, including Crimea, from the very beginning. Mr. Vučić, president of Serbia, has mentioned this in the interview with CNN in 2014, and the position hasn't changed. Secondly, despite enormous pressure from Russia, Serbia has never given diplomatic or official status to the staff of the Russian-Serbian Humanitarian Center in Niš. I will also remind you that official Belgrade provided perhaps key intelligence support to the authorities in Montenegro at a critical moment in 2016, and thus helped neutralize the attempt to forcibly overthrow the democratic government in Podgorica. Also, let me remind you of the discovery of, for Russia, a very unpleasant spy affair 2 years ago, when it was determined that an agent of the Russian military intelligence service paid for sensitive information to a retired Serbian military intelligence officer. I also remind you that Serbia has joined all the decisions of the European Union regarding Belarus, including the suspension of civilian flights with that country. On the other hand, I think that if we have this black and white view of relations between Serbia and Russia, we neglect a lot of things. My deep conviction is that the largest part of the current opposition is extremely averse to Serbia's European integration, and the large part of it cultivates affection for Russia and its leader. Moreover, some of these parties and movements are undoubtedly financially and in interest tied to support from Russia, especially when it comes to conservative and right-wing groups. When it comes to Kremlin, through a seemingly neutral mediator and grandson of former Prime Minister Primakov, offered the Serbian president to form a technical government with the opposition in spring 2019, when street protests organized by Vučić's opponents took place in Belgrade. Finally, the essence of Russian influence in the Balkans is to maintain instability for as long as possible, the status quo in the two largest crisis areas, namely Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and thus a long and possibly lasting hold on the region outside the zone of European and especially Atlantic integration. The examples of Montenegro a year ago and North Macedonia, while we are talking here, show that things with the Russian influence are not over with the entry into NATO. In that sense, I do not expect particularly positive view of Russia on the project of economic regional connection, Open Balkans, which has been initiated by Serbia, Albania, and North Macedonia, because this is not in the interest of Russia when it comes to the Balkans. I wonder if the EU and the United States and even NATO has a response to this step that Russia will make. Is there a serious cost-benefit analysis of how much money Western actors have invested so far in the fight against misinformation in the Balkans, and what are the effects of that struggle? Well, I haven't seen it here, but I believe both of us have an impression that a huge amount of money has been invested in that effort and that the effect is zero. For example, the European Union supports 14 projects in Serbia alone, the purpose of which is the fight against misinformation. The EU citizens have set aside as much as 6.5 million euros for that. Well, usually the partners who implement these projects are have been the same for years now, but without effects. One of these partners, which the European Parliament treats as in its analysis as one of the three most important initiatives to combat misinformation, has existed for 12 years now. I mean, if Russian misinformation factories are getting stronger and our defense is not even visible, well, what's wrong? Why don't we analyze the facts? The European Parliament was right when it stated in February this year that detailed research has never been conducted in the Balkans on where the centers from which misinformation, fake news, and anti-Western campaigns are broadcasted are, as well as the main channels for spreading such content. Why doesn't European Union or NATO assesses harmful effects and thus see through which partners it should oppose them? This will enable them to have a clear image of who the enemy is and who we should fight against. They are throwing millions of euros every year into futile initiatives, and something needs to be changed. At the very end, and having in mind the nature of Russian influence in the Balkans, not only in the Balkans, I would like to emphasize the issue of the fight against international corruption, especially the one that is based on human rights violations. My institution and I personally advocate that Serbia and the countries of the region adopt the Magnitsky Act and thus be in the group of the most democratic countries in which such a law already exists or is in the process. In this regard, I would like to mention that within the institute I lead, we have prepared a model of the law on restrictive measures for serious human rights violations. In this project, we have collaborated with the most eminent domestic legal experts, as well with Mr. Bill Browder and his foundation, who are credited with passing the first Magnitsky Act in America and then in many other countries. We plan to present this legal model to the domestic and foreign public and political actors in the coming period because we sincerely believe that it is a very effective mechanism for removing the core of what is usually called malignant foreign influence, and that is primarily corruption that spills over into political and economic interests. Thank you once again for allowing me to address you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dragic, for your speech. China and Russia are not only outside actors whose activities can have an influence on this region. They are obviously also other actors as well as development in the surrounding region, which can and do impact the stability and security of the Western Balkans. I, therefore, now turn to our third panelist, Esref Kenan-Rasidagic, who will provide us with a brief overview of these actors and developments. Esref Kenan-Rasidagic is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Sarajevo. He is teaching courses related to international relations, comparative politics, diplomacy, European studies, media and politics, and conflict resolutions. Dr. Rasidagic appears frequently in the media as political analyst and commentator on current political, security, and social affairs in the Balkans and the Middle East. Mr. Rasidagic, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. In my opinion, it's a very interesting panel and truly central to our discussion during these 3 days here in the Rose-Roth seminar. One of the reasons why the panel and the topic is really central is that external actors and influence of external actors has always been central to discussion of political realities and political dynamics in the entire region of what we now call Western Balkans. There are reasons why this has always been the case, both historical, realistic, and also related to more of kind of propensity of the people in the region to explain everything by reference to a kind of mythological aspects of their understanding of the situation in the region. At the current moment and this current state of affairs that we are discussing, it is only natural that external actors exercise really huge influence in the region, which is composed of small and relatively weak states that cannot be, in the current state of affairs, independent players in the international arena. But even before this situation, following the collapse of Yugoslavia during the time of Yugoslavia, which was relatively large, stable, and a country that took its independence as a kind of a central topic of its foreign policy. This has always been the case also because the supposed competition for influence in Yugoslavia by the great powers of the day, United States and Soviet Union, always played into the internal politics of Yugoslavia. We need to strengthen our unity, we need to strengthen our armed forces because there are other external actors now competing for the influence in this state which is truly central in the Balkans, which leads us to this second reason why we always emphasize the influence of the external actors in the region as probably more of with more importance than they duly deserve, and that is propensity of the people of the region to explain everything that happened through this shortcut to a supposed conspiracy that was taking place elsewhere and cooked up against the local situation, local people, local actors. We all know that some of the key developments in the recent history of this country and the countries in the region will always have alternative interpretations, sometimes really far from the reality, but these alternative interpretations will shape the political dynamics of internal politics of these countries, no matter how wild sometimes these conspiracy theories are. Yet another reason that why the external influences, external actors are really central to discussion of political dynamics inside the region is that countries of the region, but also external forces, are sometimes using this supposed influence as a pretext for political propaganda or strengthening their own influence in some of the countries in the region. And discussion of the previous speaker is a good point in this discussion, whereby Russia often plays up the supposed external influence of the countries of external actors in the region in order to prop up their own influence. Or another example, for instance, that you hear very often, especially in the past 20 years, is supposed influence of various radical Islamic interpretations among the various segments of the Muslim population in the Western Balkans. Now I'll take a little bit of time to try to explain the three types of external influence that I see could be identified when discussing the actual or supposed influences by different external actors in the countries in the region. The first one, which I term the pure external influence, is the influence of the countries, outside countries that are working without a local agency in one or more of the countries in the region of the Western Balkans. Among these countries and influences is, for instance, the influence of China that was discussed by one of the previous speakers, which is an example of a country which is far away, which has some interests in the region that is really far away from its perceived area of political influence and interest, which is Southeast Asia, which comes here through the investment with the help of economic factors and tries to play some role, but does that clearly without reference to the internal actors. China doesn't sponsor political parties, not yet. In the region, China doesn't have a sympathetic civil sector in any of the countries in the region that work in its interest. It's trying to establish NGOs, it's trying to form this kind of support, but it's still not there. United States, surprisingly, in my opinion, is a similar example. United States is an external country, is a superpower country that played extensive role in the region during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina and also during the Kosovo intervention, 1995 and 1999 respectively. Their influence proved to be decisive in ending these conflicts on different terms. It proved to be decisive in establishing the framework, constitutional framework and state framework for this situation on the ground following their intervention, resulting in the establishment of a very specific state of Bosnia and Herzegovina with its unique constitution worldwide, and also in seceding the territory of Kosovo from Serbia and establishment of a new separate state recognized by the United States and around 100 countries in the world, but not Serbia, not some of the key countries in the United Nations Security Council, including Russia and China. However, despite this decisive influence played by the United States, this was one of intervention. They withdrew, and they're not really involved in the region except through their security guarantees for the continuation of the statehood of Kosovo. Why am I saying this? Because, for instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the United States is often perceived as a key actor that should intervene every once in a while when the security situation deteriorates, only to be proved again and again that the United States really doesn't have any interest whatsoever, except that they will probably step in at the last moment to prevent losing face and collapse of the Dayton political order, which was something they initially sponsored. Second type of the external influences, by term mixed external influences, is the external influences working through local agents, which is the most powerful, which has always been the most powerful way of influencing internal politics of the countries where you try to exercise some influence. Excellent example in Serbia is also a previous discussion by the speaker on my right, who discussed Russia's establishment of extensive network of local supporters and local actors through which they're trying and aiming to support their political ideas and their intentions in the political process inside Serbia. However, even in this particular case, I would argue that Russia still doesn't play a central role because they have never managed to incorporate a ruling party into the network of their loyal agents, as was discussed here. The current government in Serbia is often perceived in the Western pro-Russian, but in Russia is clearly perceived as not faithful and truly loyal partner, which somehow send mixed signals as to what Russia really can accomplish in the region. And I would argue here that one of the key arguments against the centrality of Russia influence in the region is the episode long forgotten, intentionally so, in Serbia and in Russia in 2003, when Russia unilaterally, without even informing the Russian Serbian counterpart, withdrew its military contingent in Kosovo, which once and for all ended possible true influence that Russia could have on the solution of the Kosovo problem, because it is really hard to imagine the declaration of Kosovo's independence and de facto independence of Kosovo would take place if Russia still had troops on the ground. The reason given by the Russian side, we remember very much, and it was still very much the same President Putin, who is in power today, was that it simply cost us too much money. What kind of superpower thinks about a few $1 million when it comes to exercising influence in the region they perceived as key to their continuing influence in Europe. And finally, a third type of external influences I term ideological, identity or inspirational influences. And here I very much refer to some of the discussions that were taking place previously, where a country doesn't really have to work in an orchestrated manner or through the local agents in order to move the course of political process in the country in particular direction. Rather, their influence going through the cultural and ideological channels serves to inspire sympathetic people in the region to work towards the accomplishment of the goals that they are probably desiring, but not really controlled or not really influenced by them. A good example again is Russia through the support of these night wolves, these symbolic movements. Turkey in Bosnia and Herzegovina has very limited factual involvement. They invest 10 times more money in Serbia, for example. In Bosnia, they rank 11th on the, they don't rank among the top 10 foreign investors in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And when you know that year by year, if you invest 20 million euro, you will rank among the top 10 investors. So small are the direct foreign investments in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Turkey doesn't rank among the top foreign investors, then you can understand that their involvement is really symbolic. But on the other side, their interpretation of the politics in the region and the political dynamics whereby they portray themselves, Turkey portrayed itself as a victim of Western conspiracy to overthrow Islamist-leaning or Muslim government in Europe, plays on the sympathetic ear of a number of people who are very disappointed by the delays in the European integrations, NATO integrations. It's been taking place forever, it's been around for 30 years. Turkey is a similar position that kind of rings a bell, and a lot of people in this regard become sympathetic to Turkey. This is not backed by true support, real investment or anything, but a rather ideological and inspiring a component. Despite, now a little bit on a critique of the centrality of the external influences in the political dynamics of the region, despite the continuing emphasis on the centrality of these influences in political influences and in political processes and dynamics in the region, there we have to bear in mind that no matter how strong the influence is and no matter how direct the influence is, as is the case with China, United States in 95, 99, or Russia more recently in Serbia, political dynamics of the region doesn't really happen due to the involvement or with the large input from the external influences, except in the cases of mixed type of international involvement, external involvement, whereby countries in the region themselves are sponsoring their agents in neighboring countries in order to achieve favorable political outcomes in internal politics of the country. I will name two examples to illustrate the validity of this point, and this is Bosnia and Herzegovina, whereby internal politics of the country very much happens through the input of the neighboring countries of Serbia and Croatia that definitely have their interest in the country and are sponsoring political actions, economic actions, and sometimes bordering on the security field of security in order to further their interest in the region. So, for instance, a good example of this, despite the continuing repetition of that we had the chance to hear yesterday from some of the leading political figures here in Serbia, that Serbia respects political integrity and institutions of neighboring countries, including Bosnia and Herzegovina. In a previous panel, we had a gentleman from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Serbia who was responding to a question on the influence of Milorad Dodik, who is widely perceived as working not as an agent, he's an independent actor, but in concert with Serbian foreign politics in the region. And he was widely, and in responding to this question, he was saying that, well, Dodik is not to blame. Well, if you proclaim your separate armed forces, decide that state institutions don't have authority in your entity, and so on and so forth, that's not really important. What is really important are some other problems that forced Milorad Dodik into action. And according to his words, I'm not sure if he's here in the audience, the problems are the decision of the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina regarding the ownership of the forests and lands in the entities. According to this decision, the state-owned land and forests are not owned by the entities but by the state. Rather technical legal question that has wide repercussions, of course, in different fields. Imagine if, for instance, some of the gentlemen who are representing state institutions of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there's three of them here, would in their speeches question the decision of the Constitutional Court of Serbia, saying that that's a problem, we need to discuss it. As someone pointed out, I mean, this is really not a buffet that you take from what you like and return what you don't. Decisions of the Constitutional Court of a sovereign countries are just that. It's not there for you to accept them or not, but this was really a good example where Serbia, for instance, respects the state institutions of Bosnia and Herzegovina, sovereignty and territorial integrity, but they don't like this particular institution, the decision, and they will sponsor their agent in Bosnia and Herzegovina to go against this by threatening to secede the half of the country in order to kind of change or force the change in this wording of this particular decision. This is what I think are the key external influences that bear the repercussions for the statehood of the countries in the region and should be discussed. The second example, obviously, coming from this is Kosovo, where both Serbia and Albania are playing a role, and actually by intervening more and more forcefully among their clients in Kosovo, Serbia among the 5 municipalities populated, where majority of population are Serbs, and Albania, of course, but through the sponsorship of the political institutions and structures in Pristina, they serve as centrifugal forces that are rather threatening to break the country apart. So recent actions that were mentioned so many times in these past 2 days, where special units of the police are going to north and why are they there and whatever, are an example of this. Probably government in Pristina, we don't know for sure and we can't really know over here, probably government in Pristina was encouraged by their sponsors to exercise the authority that is rather limited in the north by sending the special police forces to the administrative border crossings or border crossings, whatever you call them, to show that government of Kosovo exercises authority and government of Kosovo exists. On the other side, this sprung Serbian side into action. They can't intervene directly, but they very much caused so much trouble through their local agents, Serbian population that is easily mobilized and controlled by Serbia in order to contest the authority of Kosovo government in this territory. Further destabilizing country, and then someone earlier pointed out, Marko Prelec, yes, jeopardizing the future of people living in the region, same like in Bosnia, whose only interest, true interest probably is better lives and more security and more stability. And finally, I would point out one aspect of this ideological or inspirational type of external influences that is not proactive in the sense that someone is either inspiring or is happy that his culture inspires local actors in the region, but is rather negative in a sense that a number of people in countries that are not yet part of the European Union, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia especially, Albania, Kosovo, are hugely disappointed by whatever West or the European Union had to offer them. Immediately after 1995, I'm talking about the example of Bosnia and Herzegovina, for instance, ending of the war, there was so much optimism, there was a large international presence, and there was a clear promise, or at least it was understood to be a true promise by the West. Be good, be nice, reform, do whatever you can, and we'll take you in, you'll become like us. You know, 30 years later, almost 30 years later, nothing is happening, and the West and the European Union seem to be farther away than ever. Instead, we are talking about new wars and instability and everything that will take us further away from this. And so many speakers have previously pointed out that a lot of large part of the electorate, large part of population in all of these countries in the region are having rather negative view of the European Union right now, whose influence they deem unfair, in a sense that so much was promised, yet the only thing that we saw was a number of bureaucratic obstacles and steps that were thrown into the process of integration, and requirements that are now asked of the Western Balkan countries to fulfill were never fulfilled by any of the European Union countries in the last 2 enlargements that took place before the enlargement of the European Union onto the Western Balkans will probably never take place. Instead, for all the sponsorship of voting for the, let's say, opposition social democratic parties, being civil, work with the NGOs, you know, proving that you are European and in outlook and in action, everything what you get is not enough, you're bad, you're corrupt. Yes, we are, but not myself personally. Our politicians are. And eventually, kind of speeches such as the one by President Macron after one country changed its entire identity and called itself a different name just to fulfill the initial step that they thought will lead to the opening of the negotiations for the membership in the European Union, North Macedonia, and then Macron and the others who now agreed with him in Europe were saying, like, you'll probably never be in the European Union now after all. And what does it say about the appeal that the European Union and the Western and the liberal ideologies will have in the region? They're very negative, and they're pushing people further away and into the open arms of these kind of rather radical ideologies that I was previously talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dagish, for your speech. Now I open the floor for the questions. As a chairman, I would like to ask you questions for the both lectors about the Russian and China influence. How big this influence? Maybe you can to show some figures, amount of the money or percentage of the comparing with another country, which place take like Russia or China in the all investment in Serbia. Thank you very much. Mr. Bastian, are you ready?
With regard to, Ivan, the Chinese investment in individual countries, I don't have slides to highlight that, but I can, for example, send it to the organizers. It's important to differentiate two aspects. We've heard yesterday, for example, from the brief intervention about the Foreign Investment Council that took place in the Metropole Hotel regarding Serbia, that over 68% of investment last year in Serbia is EU-related investment. When I talk about China, I always try to make it clear that, and this was my point in the last part, do not exaggerate China's influence, also in terms of its investment influence. It is there, it is visible, it is long-term, it will continue, but keep it in perspective. China has, for example, with regard to Serbia, an investment volume aggregate, and aggregate as an economist means taken together compared to all other countries, of about between 4 to 6%. Yes, that is small. But in my view, it's not about the aggregate numbers. China is not interested of having an investment volume totally in Serbia, for example, of let's say 15, 20% or 30. That's not how China proceeds in the region of Western Balkans. Instead, it is very selective. It identifies opportunities. It analyzes the conditions. It reaches out to those who have the capacity to make arrangements, to reach lending compromises, and to sign contracts. If you then look more specifically in an individual sector, and let's stay in Serbia, copper and mining, or zinc mining, an important part of energy, there all of a sudden China's level of investment is much higher than the aggregate numbers. That's why I would always say, keep it in perspective, focus on the specifics. Don't exaggerate China's footprint.
Thank you. Mr. Dragic.
Pa da objektivno posmatramo stvari, što se tiče
As for the Russian investments in Serbia, if we exclude investments in intelligence, underground, extreme West-wing organizations, political parties, then we can say that there are no other Russian investments in Serbia apart from these. If you're talking about trade, that's a different thing. On the other hand, Serbia is dependent on Russian gas and energy, and there is only exchange in this direction. There are no other investments instead of the fact that our government has lucratively sold our oil industry of Serbia, both with its minings in both Serbia and abroad. The oil industry of Serbia was sold to the Russians for 3 times lower price than the price offered by Ernst & Young and Tush companies. So the answer is there are no Russian investments in Serbia. Everything that the Russian ambassador is saying and their officials, it is all based on emotions, brotherhood, and so on. But Russians are not among even first 15 investors in Serbia. They're not here, like I said, when it comes to direct investments.
Laura Martinho, Portugal.
Thank you very much. I would like, first of all, to say that this was a very interesting panel. And I have a question for John Bastian. You mentioned a number of Chinese investments, and by consequence, the ties between Serbia and China have strengthened through these sizable investments, and investments that have been accompanied by massive Chinese lending, high-level political meetings, and the procurement of Chinese arms. So what do you think that can be the impact of these Chinese investments on Serbia-EU membership process? Do you think that it can jeopardize it? And you also talked about transparency regarding the Chinese investments. And I have a question. Have there been any legislative changes in Serbia to ensure more transparency regarding these investments? Thank you very much.
Please, Bastian.
Thank you for the question. From Portugal, I would argue that comparatively with regard to the other 6 countries in the Western Balkans, with all 6 countries in the Western Balkans, Serbia has, over the course of the past 5+ years, become the preferred partner of China in the region. That as a point of departure. With regard to the element of transparency and current or possible future legislative changes, one aspect that I follow closely in the session negotiation process between Serbia and the European Commission is something that is not part of a chapter yet, but which will play a role further down as Serbia opens other chapters, in particular those related to economy and finance. And that is a new regulation that was introduced by the European Commission in October of last year called Investment Screening Mechanism. That means requiring individual countries to screen and to coordinate, harmonize with the regulations, framework regulation of the Commission, their foreign investment screening procedures, in particular foreign investment screening procedures that relate to non-EU investments, under which can fall the United States, Russia, China, or for that matter, Singapore. That process is ongoing inside EU member states. That is going to be part, in my view, of a very sensitive element of bilateral negotiations between Serbia and the Commission. One other point, with regard to legal aspects. Serbia is, like other countries in the region, a member of the so-called energy community. Hence, it has, without being a member of the EU, signed up to certain environmental standards, to respect them, to implement them and to accordingly also harmonize its own legislation. And there it will be interesting for me to observe in the coming years, because this is a project that doesn't immediately set in, of the so-called carbon tax harmonization mechanism that the Commission has proposed and that is now part of an obligation, including of the energy community members in the Western Balkans. And this carbon harmonization mechanism means also to what degree do you have carbon adjustment in price setting between countries in the Western Balkans who do business with EU member states.
Thank you very much. Next question will be group by two. First one will be Dragan Sormas, and next one will be Ahmet Ildiz from Turkish. Dragan?
Thank you. Drage kolege.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I'll try again as a host to emphasize some other things. This is a very interesting panel and a topic. I'll start with what Mr. Bastian said, that he can hardly wait for us to go to Smederevo, not just to visit two wineries and a fortress, but because in Smederevo there is a huge Chinese investment. It's a steel plant. It's an old steel plant that was privatized for the first time in the beginning of last decade. And let me inform you, at that time it was bought by the U.S. Steel Company. It's a U.S. company, U.S. Steel, and it was owned by U.S. Steel for 15 years. And they are also owners of a much larger steel plant in Slovakia, which is in the EU, in Košice, in Slovakia. So the U.S. Steel left the steel plant here in Serbia. Not a single investor from the EU was interested in buying this steel plant, nor anyone from the U.S., because there was an economic crisis at the moment in the world. There was a huge crisis of the steel price in the market. The Chinese wanted to buy it. They bought it, and it's functional. If you have an opinion, if you have an opportunity to ask Smederevo populations about what are the conditions now, well, they would say, well, when the U.S. company was here, it was much better. They were investing in the environmental protection in local community. Today, the Chinese are not doing it. The Chinese investors, the Chinese owner of the factory, of the plant, pays what he owns to the state, and everything else is in his or her possession. They are not investing in environmental protection. They are not interested in the local community. I mean, that's the Chinese investment. I'm talking openly. But let me repeat, no one else applied to buy this steel plant other than them. And one more thing I need to tell you. U.S. Steel in Slovakia is now negotiating with the same company his steel Chinese company, to buy the steel plant in Slovakia. Another problem is the mining in Bor.
Ljudi sa niskim zaradama I veoma teškim.
Mine in Bor, people have low salaries. Well, Canadian company bought this and they were there 10 years. They were investors. They stayed there for 10 years, but they left. Then the Chinese company came and they bought the mine, copper mine in Bor. It's in the east of Serbia. Last month, a U.S. company, NCR, opened an NCR office in charge of the entire Europe here in Belgrade. It has 500 employees. It has the lowest salary in that the lowest salary is, I think, 500 euros. That's good salary for Serbia. When the Prime Minister was talking about digitalization of Serbia. It turned out to be that young people, our young people, turned out to be very talented when it comes to IT sector. But we are losing a lot of other experts like doctors, medical staff, and others who are leaving to the EU countries to work. Let me give you one more example. The Chinese, using their loans, they planned to build a fast rail track between Belgrade and Thessaloniki. The European Commission saw this, and what did they decide? They decided to give a better offer than the Chinese investors. They made a better offer to Serbia, and the President Vučić accepted it. So the European Union decided to make half of this railway track from its own funds, and another half Serbia can construct it in cooperation with the European Bank and through the favorable loans. So I'm appealing to my colleagues, MPs from all the EU member states, Spain, France, Italy, Germany, Portugal. You have to speed up the European integration process of the Western Balkans if you want these influences, the Russian and Chinese influences, to stop here. The fact that European integration process is slow, it gives them some room to react. And now I give the message to my colleagues from Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and then we will, keep Russia away. They will no longer be able to act as they act here and cause other problems, and they do not even invest in Serbia or in the Western Balkans. And only then will, issues that they make in your countries will become priorities for EU member states. So let us speed up European integration here so that we can help our friends from Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia. Thank you.
From Turkish delegation.
Thank you, Chair. Let me make some contribution. I agree with Dragan that the EU path of the region should be speeded up, but also NATO accession, NATO path of the countries which demand this speeded up, especially Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ashraf Bey's comments, I should add something. I appreciate all the remarks on this. Of course, this criticism always we face in Bosnia. How come Turkish investments in Serbia is 20 times more than the investment in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Of course, investment is a private sector issue, and all countries in the region deserves the investment, especially from regional countries like Turkey and from all around the world. And Bosnia and Herzegovina deserves a real affirmative action on this issue. Due to the reasons and situations summarized by Marko Prelec in the previous session, Bosnia deserves affirmative action. But on the investment, it doesn't work that way. Private sector works in another way other than public sector. Yes, it is true that Turkish investment in Serbia is much more than in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But for the reasons that of investment environment. And it is not the fault of Bosnia, Herzegovina and Bosniak people, and it is the fault of the Dayton system decision mechanism and that RS leadership which undermines every decision making. Anyhow, to address this problem, indeed, Turkey made a tailored approach on Bosnia-Herzegovina. Turkey's commitment to Bosnia-Herzegovina is not just government-wise, but also civil society, municipalities, try to make their contribution to Bosnia and Herzegovina. But investment is the best. Economic investment, which contributes to the production, income, purchasing power of the country, is the best. To address this, indeed, we made a tailored approach inspired by the EBRD credits. You know, Turkish businessmen make some investment in Bosnia and Herzegovina by EBRD credits. It is okay. But it is not seen in the investment as Turkish investment. It is okay, no problem. Since we couldn't enforce the private sector to invest, we made another approach. We put some soft loans with zero interest to encourage investors future investors in Bosnia and Herzegovina to invest in their own country. We put when I was ambassador, 100 million euros plus 50 million plus with zero interest for 10 years. It will be extended, of course. Just the banks get their commission. So thanks to these soft loans, many factories, many investments, entrepreneurs survived the crisis by refinancing their debts. Some individuals and small, medium enterprises expanded their investments, all made new investments. So many of the companies now survived thanks to these soft loans. We made this because when we analyzed the situation, we saw that donations don't make desired contribution in Bosnia and Herzegovina. No longer, because. So I think we made some good decision, and it helped a lot in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But still, I wish that Turkish private sector should invest more. But of course, private sector is free on its decision. Hopefully, that I see the real key is here. The EU integration of Bosnia and Herzegovina and MAP process. I hope that Bosnian actors in Bosnia and Herzegovina will unblock these decision-making mechanisms, and then it will create more investment-friendly atmosphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. How I understood, you don't have questions, yes? But for the Sormash questions, Mr. Bastian want to answer, please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have noticed from the forceful intervention of Mr. Sormas to what degree it is really a highlight to go to Smederevo, and for many different reasons to do so. And I fully agree with your interpretation that the absence of US or European interest opened the door wide for others who took a look at first Smederevo or also in Boen, the copper mine. That means China saw opportunity in a very specific area where others identified only risks. And that is a playbook that you can see in also other areas of investment of China in the region. While leaving the door open, China looks for opportunities. And I have argued already in my presentation, it is a legitimate interest of China, and it is also a mutual interest. Because as you have heard from Mr. Sormas, both sides want this kind of investment. It's not Chinese influence arriving here. It is also being invited to have a look at such investment opportunities. The European side, and I mean not only the EU, because I think we should not mix and synonymously EU with Europe. That also applies, for example, to countries like the UK or Switzerland or many others. I think that many European investors, they are now playing catch-up. They are trying to get into an area in the Western Balkans where China is now positioned. And this playing catch-up is also reflected in how NATO addresses China, in how the European Commission is trying to address in different strategy papers a China policy. It is playing catch-up 10 years too late. And that should be part also of the conversation, why we waited for so long.
Thank you. Next will be in group Agnes Valde from Hungary and Mr. Marko Prelec speaker. Please, Agnes.
Thank you very much. Let me start with self-criticism. If you agree with that, you can question that or agree with me. So we all know in the transatlantic region and in the European Union where our values lie, yeah? Those countries want to join NATO and or EU, they also know their values lie. But business is different. This is what we have experienced in the past many years. We all know from all the NATO documents that China and Russia, they are challenges. Challenges from security point of view, they are challenges from technological point of view. And like it or not, this is the situation. So we can blame China and Russia for what they are doing in either the Western Balkans or in the territory of the EU, but EU and NATO also have to reflect to those challenges. So we ourselves have to do something to change the current situation we are facing. And this is not only in the Western Balkans, let us be clear. Because in Hungary we have been experiencing exactly the same thing. In order to have a foreign direct investment, it's not just the country that is investing, it's the country that is accepting the investment that also counts. That counts actually more. Because you need political will and political agreement to accept a foreign direct investment from a country you're dubious about. You also have to take into account what Dragan was saying, that you have to face that the standards of investment might be different from your country's standards and even from the community's standards. And yes, what we see is the question of visibility, or more precisely, the lack of visibility we see. Let me bring you two examples. The fourth block of the nuclear power plant in Hungary is being built by Russia, Rosatom. This was an agreement signed by the government in 2014. The European Commission approved finally this investment. Still today, members of the Parliament have no access to the agreement. We don't know the financial conditions of this agreement, and it is approved by the Commission. And Western companies are going to work on these investments. So this is a huge problem and a huge question. Second is, as it was mentioned by Jean-Bastien, Budapest-Belgrade railway line. We don't know the content of the agreements signed here with China. I'm a member of the Parliament. I'm the member of the Defense and Law Enforcement Committee, Vice Chair, and I don't know any information about that. And this is the problem. It's never the investment the problem, it's the conditions of the investment and the visibility of the investment. The third is Fudan University. Fudan University is coming to Hungary. The Hungarian government is giving a huge territory and investment, and the current government is investing taxpayers' money into Fudan University. Maybe it is good, maybe it is not. I don't know, because we don't know the details. And I'm not blaming China or Russia for that. Of course, it's their interest to go into even an EU country. It's the political will and the readiness of a government to be open and sincere about these investments. So here, European Union also have a role, a very important role to play, introducing standards for everybody, including not just Hungary, but Germany and all other countries, and making it clear that Western Balkans, in whatever on, we want this region to be in the European Union, because that is our very interest from the economic point of view, from a security point of view, from a cultural point of view, from every point of view. And if we want that, we should set the rules for everybody. so that they know how we should go together. I think this is very important, and I agree with Jean-Bastien that unfortunately for many, many years, this region was too risky for European and transatlantic investors to come in because they knew very little about the region. So it is our MPs' task to tell our partners in Western Europe and, of course, in the United States of America that, yes, there is always risk in the investment, always, but this is a very good place. There are people who want to work, they want to build countries, they want to, live their life like anybody else in Hungary, in Germany, in Austria, and in the United States of America. So this is, I think, and I would like to ask you, Mr. Bastian, do you agree with that this is also our responsibility to tell the information to our colleagues that, yes, this is a good place, and it is our very interest to have these countries as quickly as possible in the European Union and, of course, in NATO. Thank you very much.
Next question will be from Marko Prelec, our speaker on the right side.
This is a question for Dr. Bastian. Although others are welcome to weigh in, are there any significant party-to-party links between the Chinese Communist Party and governing parties in the region, probably principally here in Serbia, but elsewhere?
Thank you, Marko. I will take one question more from Yegor Chernov from Ukraine, and I have on the list 3 questions more, and I closed. Yeah, you will be, and I closed the questions also. Yeah, thank you, Yegor.
Yeah, well, thank you for reports. My question will be to Orhan. Actually, a few weeks ago we had Parliamentary Assembly in Lisbon, and actually we had the report about the Russian Federation and their influence in European Union, in different countries. And according to the resolution of this report, the relations between NATO and Russian Federation right now on the lower level since the Cold War II, because of the aggressive behavior of Russian Federation in European countries. I mean, this is disinformation, this is cyber attacks, this is corruption of politics, this is actually actions, combatant actions in Ukraine and Georgia, and poisoning the citizens in the UK. So Russian Federation has a quite massive tool of actions inside different countries. And their behavior, violations of international law, for now it's the reason of the imposition of sanctions, actually, and do not to do the business as usual with this country. So my question is, well, we understand what exactly Russian Federation want to achieve in Ukraine. They just want to stop our path to NATO, to European Union, and want to make to take under control the whole territory. What would you, what exactly, in your opinion, the goal in this region, in Serbia, especially of Russian Federation, what the next steps do you expect from Russian Federation of their influence on this, and what are your counteraction for this influence on this region and on Serbia especially? Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. Who will answer? Dragos, yeah, please.
Hvala.
Thank you. So first, to answer the question of why sanctions that international community, I mean, I'm referring to the Western countries, imposed against Russia, and why these sanctions do not have the effects for which they were adopted. Well, simply because countries that voted for imposing sanctions those very countries do not abide, but do not respect these sanctions. So there is not a uniform position towards Russia, and Russia knows this. So each country, decides on its own whether they will respect sanctions or not. Let's have a look at the North pipeline. I mean, it demonstrated a lack of unity, and Putin could only smile with pleasure when he saw the differences between the countries that imposed the sanctions. As for the influence of Russia, really we need a lot of sessions to discuss it, but the influence of Russia in Serbia and in region is permanent and very destructive. I don't want to exaggerate, but I just want to present how huge this impact is. Mr. Sharma was talking, compared, and rightfully compared. He talked about the investment that was first provided by the USA and then China, because no one else wanted to buy it. That's right, but had someone offered the conditions to the US, just like they offered to the Chinese, for example, that they don't have to invest in environment and so on, then but the US still is responsible company, and at one moment they couldn't respect the standards they want to and make the profits. Privatization is not just about whether someone will buy the mine or not. No, the responsible decision would be, okay, if the industry doesn't have a buyer, then we'd better close it down and give some subsidies, then let the companies that do not take care of the environment, just like the Chinese companies do not take care of the environment, it's better to close it than to give it to these companies, because it's going to have a long-term consequences in our country. Russia is not withdrawing also, although although Montenegro entered the NATO, joined NATO, and Macedonia joined NATO, Russia found its way back to these countries. And that's why the question is, what are we going to do, I mean, organizations and we personally, to resist such Russian influence so that it is not destructive and that it does not result in the fact that the Balkans, the region, deteriorate from the path they are on right now to becoming a part of the European civilization where they naturally belong. Well, a lot depends on NATO, EU, and the US.
Thank you. Mr. Bastian?
Two issues were addressed to me. I'll start with the last one, Marco, with regard to party-party links. I myself am not aware. There's very little visible evidence of party-to-party links. Let me give you one example. I don't want to overblow it, but it is something that at least shaped visibility, a narrative. The very small Communist Party in Serbia put up billboards this year thanking brother Xi Jinping in downtown Belgrade with regard to the vaccine diplomacy of China. But I am not aware of any other official party links. I am happy to be corrected about that. It is something that's very difficult to identify. Hardly anybody officially in Beijing or in any other country of the region talks about it. But there are elements of what I would call examples of soft power capacity that are visible. You can see that in the manner in which so-called Confucius institutes are developing across the region in the Western Balkans, or how China is financing academic chairs in individual countries, or very much Due to the pandemic, it is not possible anymore to travel there for the past 2 years, but in the past, very strongly trying to shape media narratives through the invitation of journalists from the region to stay for a longer time in Shanghai or in Beijing and to study certain aspects of China with extensive possibilities. That kind of soft power capacity is much more visible than the party-to-party links. With regard to Agnes from Hungary, just a few comments on the Fudan University campus investment. That is really a remarkable development. So far, and not to be misunderstood, it is a proposal. It is not happening yet on the ground. But it would be the first time that in an EU member state, China invests into building a university. That means investing in higher education. That has huge consequences. Who is the teaching staff? Who are the students? What kind of publications are possible? What topics will be taught? These are interesting questions, and I would look forward to having answers or a debate about these answers. But it tells you two things. Again, it is an area where China identifies opportunities that others have not done. It is again in the lead. It takes the lead there. Mr. Soros in Hungary had to leave the Central European University, and China is coming and is being invited, while Mr. Soros was literally thrown out. It also tells you something about because I said it's proposed. During the summer of this year, there was a very strong pushback from parts of civil society in Hungary against the proposal. Large street demonstrations where people said, no, this goes too far. We should respect that, and it is also then interesting to see how the Chinese side will respond to that kind of pushback. Finally, in reaction to this development, Prime Minister Orban has proposed a referendum on the issue sometime next year. I look forward to its outcome.
Thank you, Mr. Bastian. Last two questions will be from Tiona Akubaurdia from Georgia and Camila Aydin from Turkish delegation. Please, Tiona.
Thank you very much. Again, Mr. Dragan, thank you for mentioning Georgia and Ukraine. I think we are sharing the legacy of conflicts and the reality, hard reality, which is due to this fact. I think that when we are talking about the influences, especially Russian influences, it's visible in all countries. Georgia, as Ukraine, has been punished for its independent sovereign policy, foreign policy, as well as democratic. And I would like to agree with Ms. Vadai about the values and shared values. Yes, Russia is challenging not only our foreign policy, sovereign foreign policy, but also our values and our democracy. And when we are talking about what should we do all together in order to maintain peace and security and stability in Europe, I think that's the only alternative is to become the part of the EU, and in Georgian and Ukrainian cases it is to become a part of the NATO in order to have security umbrella and in order to have the chance to develop our country in a way we want to, in a stable and prosperous way. And there is a need of coherent strategy from NATO and EU for that, to ensure the peace in Europe, including Georgia, which belongs to the wider Black Sea region as well as South Caucasus. But my question would be how conflicts, legacy, Kosovo affects the role of Russian influence in Serbia, active measures, activные мероприятия, and malign influences which we have seen in other Balkan countries, and what is the strategy of Serbia to counter these active measures? And in terms of the Chinese influence, when Mr. Bastian was talking about the Chinese influence in the region,
I must say that we have the similarities even in my country, in Georgia, where we have the free trade agreement with China. But my question would be this so-called soft power instruments used by China. What are the observations whether the soft power instruments has been modernized in this time, and what should be the deterrence? You said that we should not emphasize the Chinese issue too hard, but they are increasing their soft power instruments and Confucius University or other means. So what are the new realities in that term in the region, and what should be the strategy from the countries to balance those interests? Thank you.
Camille Aydin, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair. And I would like to start with my thanks to all panelists, as it has been very beneficial and interesting panel. And we have heard and learned quite interesting things. And, you know, with regard to what has been said in the panel, I think we tried to learn something about the main factors and actors in the Western Balkans. But when I listened to you, you know, you mainly focused on three major powers: USA, partly USA, and then Russia. Mainly we focused on Russia and China. And comparing within themselves, you know, one's influence is quite cultural, as Orhan Dragas said, ideological and cultural side, and which is not so dominant or effective. We couldn't get the proper result, or Russia didn't get the result as they wished. But when it comes to China, you know, I think China benefited a lot in terms of their goals by investing. So comparing these two powers and their means they used in the region. And on the other hand, I think this is a global issue anyway. When I heard the things you have said, the things we have been discussing in different panels, organized by PACE, organized by OCPA, or some other meetings of NATO PA as well. So comparing these two results, you know, the investment and the cultural and ideological one, investment is quite effective. But, and in the light of all these explanations, I would like to direct my question to Jens Bastian. Sir, you said, you know, I think we should not exaggerate it. So when you say this, I might be mistaken to understand. So does it mean that, you know, we shouldn't talk a lot about it? We should ignore it? We should, you know, I think just leave it aside and try to take into account the precautions. And can you elaborate a bit more? What do you mean by saying, you know, we should just, you know, not exaggerate? Can you elaborate a bit more? What do you mean by saying this? Thank you.
And one more very short question, Nikola Lavrinović from Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Hvala lijepa, Ivane, i mogućnost da nešto kažem. Dakle, prije svega, profesoru Rašidagiću, dakle, nije ništa spomenuo o utjecaju.
Anything about effect of Russia and China on the developments in Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially when we talk about Security Council of the Federation and the regulation of the high representatives. I remember, if I noticed well, that Mr. Rašidagić said that many promised a lot in Bosnia and Herzegovina, probably the western parts. The western parties promised a lot, but those promises were not fulfilled. I think there were some technical and political interventions by the High Representative Office. For example, when it comes to the flag, car registration plates, and so on. So everything is adjusted to the situation. However, the High Representative's Office made some political decisions that are creating problem now. For example, under the pressure of the High Representatives, we adopted the laws on the Prosecutors' Council, on the public media, the change of constitution of federation, change of constitutions of the two districts, and those decisions that were strong caused problems, and these issues and problems still exist. They are now even more ardent than they used to be. So you did not comment on that, you did not mention that. Perhaps this is the gap that perhaps Russia and China are using now to meddle with or interfere with the issues that should be tackled these days in Bosnia.
Mr. Dragoš.
Pa ja ću prvo da odgovorim uvaženoj poslanici iz Gruzije.
I'll answer first to the distinguished MP from Georgia as for the what's the concrete influence of Russia, or what benefit they have if they tackle or not the issue of Kosovo. Well, to put it simply, Russia has the role in the Security Council and uses it as a lever, as a leverage, as a means to affect Kosovo, to exert influence on Serbia. As you know, we sold our resources to Russians for very low money because we wanted as support for Kosovo. And another problem that was well noticed, I will dare to speak just about Serbia at this moment. Our government and previous governments, for sure, did not have, the wish to resist the Russian and Chinese influence. That's very big problem. If we are talking about the mechanisms and the ways in which we should resist, it means that there needs to be a will for resistance. And our government believes that the Chinese, investments are a problem, that they are corruptive, because Russia's would be the same, but they do not exist. But if those who make decisions, if decisions makers do not see a problem in the influence that foreign countries exert here, then it's a bigger problem than the investments themselves. And that's the case with our government. So Serbia is not a country aspiring to become a NATO member state, although that's a huge mistake. But I'm not a decision maker. Mr. Shormas is promoting this. But the EU is really directly to be blamed for what's happening here in region, what's happening in Armenia, in Georgia, because what we call the Slovenian process, when the Balkan was given hope and was publicly promised to be integrated in the EU, 19 years have passed since then, and we only have those promises, and no one believes in this sentence. No one believes when someone says that the Balkans has European perspective. No, the Balkans needs to have the European certainty, and it does not. And that's why young people and middle-aged people decreasingly believe in the EU.
Thank you for the question. I'll just briefly answer because of the shortage of time. I didn't speak about Russia because that was a topic addressed by the other speaker, so I focused on other external influences. In particular in Bosnia and Herzegovina, if I can say a few words about the Russian influence, the principal difference between, for instance, Chinese influence in the region, Russian influence in the region, is that China is trying to build something. We still don't know yet what is it, but we can see that there is a great deal of thinking and structure behind it. I mean, building ports, establishing rail links, infrastructure, everything is done in a very, very meticulously planned manner. So what is it that they are trying to construct and establish? We still don't know what kind of new world order they are probably attempting to accomplish. We have no idea. But in Russia's case, I would argue that the case of Balkans is very much different from the case of the countries in the immediate neighborhood of Russia, such as Georgia, Armenia, that we mentioned previously, Russia doesn't really have any constructive role in the sense that they know what they want. And they are trying to build something new. That's absolutely not true. There is an excellent book by Dmitry Bechev about on the Russian influence in the region, where he termed Russia as being a spoiler force in the region. Their main interest right now is to establish the state of protracted conflict, where they've always played a role and, in effect, frustrate the interests of the West and the liberal world order in the region. That's about it. But they're not trying to take over these countries and establish something new. That one of the criticism of the perceived, as I said, only perceived interest of Russia and meddling in the in region, in particular in Bosnia and Herzegovina, was that Republika Srpska is often seen as, you know, being a puppet of the puppet master that is Russia, and they are, you know, trying to do something. Well, I tend to have the contrary opinion to this. A number of people who carefully study the region have the same opinion. They don't want Republika Srpska to secede and become an independent state. Then they will have to play a role, they'll have to be there, and they don't know what to do with this. They already have Transnistria, for instance, which is their colony, and Transnistria is a completely neglected, far-away corner of Moldova, where Russia plays only limited influence, and they have full control over the country if they want to. You know, why would they do this when they can have Republika Srpska as a spoiler force in Bosnia and Herzegovina, frustrating its efforts to join NATO, frustrating its efforts to join European Union? And that's about it. That's where the interest ends. And as for the influence of the West, speaking precisely or specifically about the office of the High Representative, well, the principal problem of the European Union is that of Bosnia and Herzegovina is that Bosnia and Herzegovina is a tripartite state. It's a country where three nations, where each given statehood, in the sense that any meaningful political decision has to be taken on the higher levels of the government will have to be approved by all three sides, which are all given essentially a statehood. That doesn't work in democracies because it translates in political process, it translates into virtual veto power, whereby, as we speak right now, since June or July this year, the entire government for Bosnia and Herzegovina is not working, has been blocked. Why? Because Dodik instructed representatives of Republika Srpska to simply sit at their workplaces and do nothing. And there's nothing you can do to overcome this because, according to the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, an 88% majority is needed to pass any decision. That's the only country in the world that has a veto power and calls itself a democracy. So the changes that you have mentioned that were introduced or decreed by the Office of the High Representative, such as the establishment of the Higher Judicial and Prosecutorial Council, a number of other institutions that didn't exist in the original Dayton, are just a logical extension of the thinking that you want to build a country, and they only become political when forces that are opposed to the functioning country of Bosnia and Herzegovina that wants to join European Union as a unified state are now questioning these decisions because they've established, they have actually taken judiciary out of the political control. The reason behind this, I was part of this effort back in 2001, if I'm not mistaken, working with the OHR. They established a separate unit, realizing that judiciary in Bosnia and Herzegovina is completely, fully under political control, and this is a condition that is simply not tolerable in a country that wants to aspire to join the European Union. They have established these bodies, and they have taken judiciary out of the hands of the politics. That cannot be a wrong decision in any country in this world that aspires to be a functioning state and a functioning democracy. This is only being politicized by the people who are in favor of not functioning state institutions, but breaking up the country, establishing three separate political and judicial frameworks within a single country. And I think it's a pretty retrograde thinking that establishment of a higher judicial and prosecutorial council, which has effectively ended the political control at least at that time, of judiciary in Bosnia and Herzegovina is a political and political decision should be politicized. I'm totally against this kind of thinking, saying again, principal problem of Bosnia and Herzegovina, three nations, three ethnic groups, each given a statehood within a single country, and then insisting on their own separate judicial systems and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I will just end there because this can drag me in a really, really long discussion, this topic. Sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Bastian?
Two issues were addressed to me. One from the Georgian delegate, who unfortunately is now not inside the plenum. With regard to soft power, I already addressed elements like, for example, the Confucius Institute's mask and vaccine diplomacy has been used as an example of what I would call soft power capacity by China in Europe, in particular at a time when there was a vaccine and mask emergency, for example, in the region of the Western Balkans. I think this helps very much, and this is how China is using it in terms of shaping narratives, trying to frame certain topics, discussions, the direction of that discussion. Let me give you one other example with regard to climate change. President Xi Jinping announced during his speech, virtual speech from Beijing at the United Nations General Assembly in September of this year, that China would withdraw financing and construction of coal-fired power plants abroad. That's an interesting development. Take him to the letter. Not only the spirit, but in practice, what consequences would that have for the 4 projects that are ongoing in the Western Balkans with regard to Chinese financing and Chinese construction companies involved? That's part of shaping narrative, but often this soft power is complementary to the investment debate that China promulgates. My last point with regard to the Turkish delegate. I would have been fundamentally misunderstood if I gave you the impression that I want to silence the conversation about China. Quite to the contrary. I'm happy that we are doing this in this panel, that you are interested in it since almost 2 hours, that in your home countries there's a debate about it, that inside NATO, inside the Commission, inside member states, we are raising awareness, we are drawing attention to it. But my plea was not to exaggerate in order to put it in perspective, in arguing that from my point of view, don't put an exclusive focus on China. That's not the solution. I think that China is not the most important problem that the Western Balkans have today. Therefore, keep it in balance.
Thank you very much for all speakers for very interesting speech. Thank you. That was very open with us. Of course, we have much more questions, but we never cannot answer for these all questions. But I have some announcement that the bus will take us now to the hotel, and the people who will go to the excursion will have the chance to 10-15 minutes to change the dress, and we go to the excursion. Approximately about 8 p.m. the bus will come back us to the hotel. Please take the comfortable shoes. Maybe Dragan wants to say something, no? No? Okay, enjoy us. Thank you very much.